My little bag.
I'd like to reconvene the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and we will start at item 4 with the announcement of actions taken in executive session by Board Counsel.
Thank you. During the executive session, the board discussed the item on the agenda and took no reportable actions.
We are now at the consent calendar. I'm going to exercise the discretion any of us has to remove an item from the consent calendar. The minutes actually still need to work, so we're not ready to deal with that at this point. So I'm going to call roll. If there are no hearings, if there are no objections, to vote approve the item 2 and 3 on the consent calendar, the review of the rule matrix, which has been distributed, and the resolution supporting J.P. Creek Forest Legacy Project Conservation Easement. And I understand that member Andre will be abstaining from that. And so could we call the roll on the consent calendar?
Okay. Janai?
Aye.
Delbar? Aye. Willis?
Aye.
Andre?
Abstain.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari? Aye. Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes with 1 abstention.
Great. I'm going to be uncharacteristically silent here. Maybe I'll get loquacious later in the meeting, but we have a big agenda, so I'm going to move directly to the report of the directors. So I believe Tom, you will be giving the director's report.
Good morning, Chairman Gillis, members of the board, Tom Porter, Chief of CAL FIRE here at Sacramento headquarters. I'll be giving the director's report on behalf of Chief Pimlon. I'm going to start with succession planning. As we have been in the last few meetings, we've been kind of keeping you abreast of changes that are occurring among our ranks. At the unit chief level, we have a new unit chief in the Santa Clara unit behind Derek Whitmer, who is retiring. Jake Hess has promoted within the unit. He was the operations chief there and has promoted to unit chief. So that'll be a change there. Further, right upstairs here at CAL FIRE headquarters, our chief counsel, Bruce Crane, who has been acting for the last 9 months. He has been appointed and is our chief counsel behind Stephanie Shamazu, who left earlier this calendar year. On to fire activity. Things have been pretty moderate in the last few weeks, and we've been seeing a lot of smoke in the air still, but that has been the good kind of smoke, prescribed fire throughout the Sierras, in the Coast Range as well, and then even into Southern California, we've been conducting burns. So we're pretty happy with that. Where we are as of to date, CAL FIRE has responded to 5,638 fires, wildfires, to a tune of 622,000 acres. So just for perspective, our average, we're just a little above average in number of fires. 5,293 would be our average, and for acreage, 231,000. So we're 3 times roughly the number of acres for just in the SRA. When you add the FRA to that, it's the total number of fires only goes up to about 7,000, but it's 1,370,000 acres that have burned thus far this year in California. We are working our way through another red flag situation in the northern part of the state. It will extend into the southern part of the state as we get closer and into the weekend. We are staffed appropriately and working with all of our cooperators to ensure that we have resources for that. With that in mind, we have shut down prescribed use of prescribed fire throughout the state until we get through this red flag, and then we'll reassess and turn that program back on probably next week, barring any fires. Along with that red flag, those red flag conditions, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and potentially San Diego Gas and Electric will be doing public safety power shutdowns. We have been noticed. We've been working through the process with Cal OES and our other partners, CPUC, to make sure that the notifications and all of the emergency services are prepared for shutdowns when they occur. We have been noticed with a 48-hour notice last night that that's likely to happen in the next couple of days. So stand by for that to happen. The Ventura Training Center, that's where our parolee crew program is initiating. Last board meeting, we had not yet initiated that, but expected to. I'm happy to report that on October 22nd, we did open the doors to the first 20 parolees, and of those, only 18 made it through the first week, but we immediately backfilled with those that we had in the queue just in the event that would happen. So we do have a cohort of 20 that are continuing to work through. They're in their first 3 months, which are soft skills, and that would be the life skills and some of the EMS starting point skills that they're going to have before they go into their fire training, which will start in January. Fuels treatment, where we are in this kind of rolls back to the prescribed fire and all the smoke that's been in the air for the last month or so. We've been able to accomplish to date 6,536 acres of prescribed burning, which last year, you'll recall, we didn't have, I don't think we had a single acre burned at this point in the season, and that's partly because of what was going on last year. But we're feeling pretty good. We're at 26% of our target for the year, so we will be continuing to work through that. On the mechanical or other types of fuel reduction, we're at just about 1,800 acres, and that's 9% of what our target is. Target of 20,000, target of 25,000 for the prescribed burning. And we're at just under 90,000 defensible space inspections. So we're moving along there as well at about 36% of our expected total for this coming year. The fuel reduction crews, the 6 crews we've been talking about for the last several meetings, we are in the process of identifying those who will be hired for a January start date. Our forestry technician list just came out, and we're happy to have for the 60-ish members that we're going to have throughout. We're happy to have 243 likely candidates on that list. So we'll be working through the hiring process in the next several months, with the intent, a couple of months, with the intent of having those crews staffed and ready to enter their training cycle in January.
I'd be interested when you're doing an analysis later, if it would be possible to know how many of the applicant pool came out of a CCC background or out of a crew background.
And we'll be very interested in that, as well as, yeah, we have a couple of different criteria that we want to look at there. Where are we getting our forestry technicians from? Thank you, Chairman Gillis. We will. Staying within fire protection, you're aware that the state, under the 2019 Defense Authorization Act, we were offered the ability to pick up 7 C-130 air tankers. Air tankers is what they will be, C-130 aircraft. And so we have accepted those aircraft, but they are going to come to us slowly because in the transfer process, they will have to be maintained and then to the standard that they need to fly the mission before we start flying, and then also retrofitted with the retardant delivery system. So we expect that as we probably won't have air tankers flying out of that fleet on state fires until 2021, 2022. We'll probably get them cycled in, and they will, while there is one that's going to be painted into the CAL FIRE colors because it is up on all of its maintenance, it's still going to take about that time, to 2021, to get the retardant delivery system installed and ready. The forest health and fire protection grants. So we've been feverishly working through our process of getting the funds allocated out to the field from the various grant programs that we've been running. Forest health in particular and fire prevention out of the GHG grant funds. In 2014-15, we identified 34 projects for $14.5 million that went out, and we're working through those projects and getting those wrapped up at this point. The 16-17 grant cycle was only 5 projects for just over $21 million. And those will continue. That was a smaller grant pool because of the projects were expanding. They were bigger projects, and that's why there were only 5. It was more of a targeted outreach and part of the tree mortality issues in the Central Sierra. In the 17-18 cycle, we have 22 projects for $91 million, almost $92 million, and then we have the fire prevention grants for 142. They're smaller grant they're smaller footprint, and they are about $80 million worth of work. So in total, we have 61 projects in the broader forest management type. We have 142 in the wildland urban interface kind of type of work, and $207 million in all of those going out to work on the ground. In the last thing I'm going to cover is kind of what's happening with our budget kind of process in the post-election time and in this transition. We are working with current administration and informing the transition team to the new administration on all of the items that I've been talking about and that have been updated to you over this past year. We will be requesting that some of those items with the Department of Finance approval will carry over into the new administration. Some of the new asks that are on the table, but it's been a little bit of a different process in that we're not doing full budget change proposals. We're doing more of an informed notification back and forth and discussion with the Department of Finance to put a placeholder in that will be then negotiated with the new administration. With that, I'm open for any questions.
Questions or comments from board members? Chief Porter. Member Andre.
Good morning, Chief Porter. Thank you for the report. The one thing I was curious about is, are there any pending cooperative project? I think it's called the Good Neighbor program, where state resources can be applied to some federal land bases, and if there any work there.
Yes, and we currently have 5 that are on the books, and we're looking at opportunities to do more. Those 5, I would have to ask on, maybe Helgi could list all 5, but we are looking for additional opportunities of these, and I didn't break it down, and I don't have the breakdown, but of the grants that are that we put out, I think I reported last meeting that about 41% of those are going to touch some federal lands through those agreements and others in order to ensure that we're having a landscape level effect. And Helgi?
Helgi, Deputy Director, Resource Management. I'm not able to rattle off all 5, but I have a good feel for where they are. Starting in the south on the Sierra National Forest, we have a project, generally fuels reduction, prescribed fire, and that's the general theme for all of them. Going north up to the Klamath National Forest, the newest one, we are working with the forest to design, according to the Forest Service, the first commercial timber sale as part of a Good Neighbor Authority. There's not a lot of volume, but we do have a field tour coming up to put the finer points on the timber sale and the trees and species and sizes to be harvested.
Okay. Member Chase.
Thank you.
But following up on Member Andre's question, this is, I guess, maybe more of a statement, but another mechanism that seems pretty effective, where potentially is use of what's called the Master Stewardship Agreement. And I believe there's one, I forget the county, but I want to say the stewardship agreement with the Stanislaus National Forest. And I know that's been done in other states as well, and it gives potentially a lot of flexibility to both the forest and the holder of the stewardship agreement to conduct the NEPA analysis and prepare the projects and the timber sales, and then revenue that's brought in can be plowed back into fund the subsequent projects, and so you have potentially kind of a self-sustaining program that could increase the number of acres treated. If it could receive some seed money to get it up and going. I believe it requires a participation of an NGO and/or a county. Needs to be involved. But I did see a presentation on that a month or 2 ago, and I thought it showed some real promise. So, hopefully we'll see more of that and potentially find, the nexus of some state funding to get some of these projects going, and then ultimately have them be kind of self-sustaining and really start to treat acres at the rate that they need to.
Duly noted, and we are looking at all of those mechanisms to partner with our federal landowners, both the Forest Service, but also BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service and others. Forest Service just happens to be the big one, so absolutely, that's something we're looking at and we'll continue to. And thank you for keeping us on our toes about it.
Yeah, that's great, and we encourage you to reach out to counties too if there's a role that they can play. I think there's some real potential.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Two questions, well, 3 maybe. The C-130s, in the written director's report, do they represent an augmentation or a replacement in your airframes available for fire suppression?
They will be augmentation. There is a slight caveat there. We're going to rotate 2 of our S2s out of the regular deployment in order to do full restoration on those airframes and maintain then over time all of our S2s to a standard that will allow them to fly for a longer lifetime. So we're going to extend the lifetime of the S2s by reducing the number in the field by 2 on an annual basis, and then we're going to increase the deployment of the C-130s above that level in order to have a heavier impact in those areas. So there will be C-130s deployed throughout the state in the fire season, and then we'll also have spares. So 2 will be in the spare kind of capacity. 5 will be deployed around the state through the season.
The other thing I wanted to question about, starting with the red flag conditions, it may be just accident and public awareness going up, but the amount of media coverage to red flag conditions seems to have gone up. Is that an independent action, or is the agency working with kind of the media sector on this?
That's an interesting question, and one that's been kind of vexing at times, particularly in Southern California, but also in Northern California, because red flag, as it was rolled out back in the early 70s and prior, was really a fire service wake-up call. It was not meant to be something that the public used for any purpose, and now the media uses it regularly as an informative tool to the public about fire conditions. And I don't think that's something we're going to be able to change. I think we've decided that that's something we really need to just embrace and work through the process of utilizing that as a tool to inform, but also add in the other pieces and parts of that, the fuel moisture and then the other conditions that really affect how fire is going to propagate on the landscape and what the danger really is. What I think has happened, and this is more just from my expertise and watching how this has unfolded, is that the utilities have really picked up on that as kind of a key point that they're going to utilize. The media already is putting that out. That's going to be kind of a trigger to kind of give a little bit of backup, but also a little bit of cover for them making the decision to do these power safety shutdowns. Again, that is my professional opinion, but it seems like that's what's going on. Each of the utilities has developed a weather control room that is helping inform their decision-making process on that, and red flag conditions are part of their formula in making that decision.
Yeah, I worry that the signal to the public is confusing.
Yes.
Right, because message is determined on the receiving end, not the sending end. What message are people receiving is a little worrisome to me.
And if you want kind of a perspective of what we in the fire services have been trying to do to combat that, it's the Santa Ana Wildfire Threat Index that happens in south of the Tehachapies. If you look up SAWT or Santa Ana Wildfire Threat Index, you'll find that comes out of the Southern GAC in cooperation with Department of Interior and Forest Service and us. And that product is geared toward more of the fire threat than the red flag as just conditions of low humidity and wind. Because of course the fuels are part of the equation, and red flag conditions don't say anything about the fuel conditions.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing, given all of the media coverage, which I read closely about utility transmission shutdowns and so forth, I just want to be clear, my understanding is correct. The decision rights on the shutdown upon a shutdown lie with the utility, is that correct?
That is,
Then they have an information requirement to the agencies, but the decision rights are on their side.
absolutely all decisions to do proactive shutdown of power are on the utilities themselves. And the department, Cal OES and CPUC wrote a letter to all of the utilities explaining related to the public safety power shutdowns, what the expectations and needs are for information flow ahead of those decisions. So we want to know when you're thinking about flipping the switch, not when you flipped the switch. So there's a letter that gives clear expectations of the state based on our needs to those utilities that have the ability to flip off the power for people.
Any other questions or comments? Great. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to the report of the executive officer, and Mr. Diaz will do that from the podium.
Well, good morning, Chair Gillis, members of the board, Matt Diaz, Executive Officer. And I too am going to be very brief this morning. I believe we have several actions reports today, so to maintain brevity, I will be brief, or I will be succinct. First of all, I want to cover a couple of staffing issues. First and foremost, a familiar face of this board is going to become more familiar, because we have recently hired Katie Harrell as a full-time board employee. Katie has been participating with this board as long as I have as an employee. And Katie, stand up real quick so everybody recognizes. And so Katie has participated with this board as a liaison on several pest matters, if you will. She's been providing updates on a nearly monthly basis for years on behalf of the Forest Pest Council, updating this board on side note death matters. And she is going to be our primary staff person as it relates to the Joint Institute for Wood Product Innovation, which is a mandate that this board received as a function of budget, or the budget change proposal related to forest carbon plan implementation. So I do believe as we move forward in time that she will be retaining some of her liaisonship with the Forest Pest Council as well, but right now her focused energy is upon standing up this joint institute. In addition to that, our regulations coordinator, Eric Hedge, is going to be on a 6-week hiatus. He is going to be spending time with his family and his new son. So until January 1st, most regulatory matters as they pertain to forest practice will be probably running through myself, and all land use issues will be running through Edith Hannigan. Moving on to the discussion of annual call for regulatory review. This is an annual process that this board engages with the regulated public, asking for any input that they may have on issues pertaining to clarity of regulations or implementation of your regulations. The notice was sent out, and I can turn your attention to tab 8 in your binder. The notice was sent out a couple weeks back. We're looking for a return of written comments in response to this call on November 21st, 2018, which will hopefully allow us enough time to synthesize the comments that we receive, compile them and synthesize them, and bring them forth to committees of the board for our annual discussion on priorities as we move towards 2019. That discussion will probably be occurring simultaneously to the review of our annual report. This is kind of the consistent pattern that we've developed over the last couple of years. So everybody in the room here, everybody online, I just want to point out that the annual call is out, and again, return written responses due on November 21st, 2018. The last issue I'm going to update you on today, and I will be receiving some help with this update, but it's going to be a discussion of 901 implementation. So we spent a fair amount of time talking about 901 already, Senate Bill 901, and the workload that it is bestowed upon this board. And in the recognition of that workload, we have had some direction from the chair on how to possibly move forward on trying to attain certain levels of efficiency as we move forward on these projects. And so you will notice that in your inboxes and in your mailboxes, and that we have been instituting staff workshops on trying to move regulatory projects forward. So far, we have been focusing those workshops solely on the issue of exemptions because it's a very intricate piece that we need to work through. But this implementation of workshops is not going to be unique only to these issues of 901 or exemptions. It's a process that we're going to try to utilize as board staff, carrying a little more of the water on some of this workload associated with regulations and trying to work through some of the more, or I should say maybe some of the less challenging points within these regulatory proposals, and then moving forward, bringing decision points that are the more challenging points of discussion to individual to committees to try to work through these regulatory proposals in a more efficient manner. It does not have to focus solely on regulation. These could be policy matters as well. It could even be down to reviewing of individual annual reports or whatever. But we're going to try to use this process and see if it works to try to move things along, spread the workload out throughout the year, and maybe not have this onslaught of end-of-year rush as we're moving towards OAL submittals and so on and so forth. So I just want to make sure that everybody in this room, again, folks that are participating online and members of this board are aware that these workshops are going to be held. They will be value key compliantly noticed. Any member of this board can participate at any given time. They will be run the same way that any committee meeting is run, except for they're going to be basically staff-driven at that point. Members of the board that are present at the workshops can participate in the discussion. If you're not present at the workshops and you're following online, you're welcome to do that, but participation at that point is limited because we have not noticed individual locations outside the location, the physical location of the workshops. So I encourage, and I think the chair encourages participation of individual members in these workshops. And you have a question, Chair.
You said participation is encouraged, but it would be participation not in the capacity of a public meeting. This would be, you could, if you were online, submit a comment.
We are not going to be taking comments from members of the board and displaying those.
I want to be clear in terms of what the participation is in a non-notice meeting.
Okay, to be very clear, participation.
Non-notice location for.
Yeah, non-notice location participation by a board member will be limited to essentially listening in and following the tenor of the conversation, if you will, or picking up the points, but not relaying conversation or participating back, if you will. It's a little challenging, I get it. It's a little awkward, but it's the way that we need to move forward. So
spend less time on commas. Right?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Is there a schedule for the rest of the meetings, workshops?
There is not, because it's kind of predicated on staff availability to a certain extent, right? We have to have our 3 or 4 hour blocks of time. We need to have the 10-day window of noticing available. I can say that I'm feeling relatively confident that as of Friday of this week, we will probably be noticing another workshop for at least 10 days out in advance. It's going to be focusing on this exemption piece. And so I don't know the date right now because I need to look at my calendar because it's going to be me that's going to be running that workshop most likely. But we are dedicated to doing this. And I must say, this is a new process. It is not fixed in stone. The only piece of it that is fixed in stone is that we are going to maintain our transparency in terms of compliance with Bagged and Keene. But the manner in which we're going to be holding the workshops, the points of discussion that we will be focusing upon, are all fed by you folks as members of the board. If there is something that you want to see or you feel is a particularly challenging point that may need additional discussion prior to a committee meeting, it is incumbent upon you to provide us direction as to what you think is necessary to be conducted within these workshops as well. It's not just a staff-driven process. We're going to hold them. We'll be in contact with you. We hope to see you in person if at all possible. And we are taking feedback from you on the process as we move forward to make it as efficient and user-friendly as possible.
I think we might entertain the idea of making a permanent item on the report of the executive officer to deal with what's transpired or is going to transpire on this.
Okay.
That way, we're checking back in with the board between the staff and board on these actions, both with respect to what's happening and what we're anticipating.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
As part of our normal course of business. Member Janai.
Do you anticipate holding any of these workshops outside of Sacramento to reach a broader base?
I have not contemplated that yet. I would tell you that well, let me step back for one moment. We actually have contemplated that as it pertains to some land use planning issues that we're going to be focusing some energy on here in the near future, where some of the land use regulations that you'll be considering will be affecting local jurisdictions and the processes in which they engage with this board. And so as we move forward on that regulatory action, I do believe we have contemplated moving them about the state of California. In terms of forest practice issues, I have not thought about that yet. We would have to look, when we start traveling, if we're doing a lot of these traveling points, they become kind of expensive, and we've got to look at our budget to make sure that our budget will sustain that level of travel. The point is noted. And as we move forward on some of these workshops, I will contemplate other locations. Generally, I will tell you that when we deal with the Effectiveness Monitoring Committee, we have kind of this 3-point points of travel, Sacramento, Redding, Ukiah. That seems to reasonably work well to cover some of the stakeholders that are available, although maybe somewhere in the Sierra Nevada may work as well. So point taken, and we will look at that as we move forward. So are there other questions at this particular point? So I will say that at this point, I would like to ask Terry O'Brien to come forward to finish up this discussion of 901 implementation. Terry, as I would suggest many of you know, is the advisor to the governor on forests, and he is asked to participate in today's board meeting, and so I've asked you to come forward, Terry.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, Chairman Gillis and members of the board. Before I turn to my very brief comments, I want to say that since being brought on board by the governor to advise him on forest issues back in June, I've been very impressed with the dedication and professionalism of the individuals working for the department. And it has certainly been my pleasure to work with all of the fine individuals who are, excellent representatives of public servants. And I think that the work, obviously, they're doing oftentimes doesn't get enough credit. So in terms of the comments, I offer these comments in consideration of the board's work on adopting the new regulations, but also for all the work all the agencies are doing. We all need a greater sense of urgency, I think, regarding the task at hand, which is restoring forest health and wildfire prevention. Forest health needs to be viewed first, I believe, in the context of global climate change, which is a significant threat to our forests. Government agencies need to be willing and not afraid to push the envelope when considering solutions to the problems we face. Perfect is the enemy of good. No approach or solution will be a silver bullet or likely to please everyone. Seek agreement, but don't let differences impede timely decisions. Your work here is critical to the success of the state's efforts to improve forest health. Legislation passed this year, Senate Bill 901, directs the board to adopt emergency regulations. This is a clear indication of the legislature's belief that it is critical to the board to move expeditiously. There are a number of very important components in this legislation. I'll mention just two: the small timberland owner exemption and allowing multiple owners to apply for non-industrial timber management plans and working forest management plans. I think those two items in particular can help move us in the direction we need in terms of addressing overgrown forests that are prone to wildfires. We have to keep thinking about how to increase pace and scale. How are we going to achieve the goal of treating 1 million acres per year, which is 500,000 acres per year on national forest lands and 500,000 on private and state land? Currently, I think that's an open question. I don't doubt the good intentions of all the agencies, but we face a significant challenge. We're doing a lot of good things, including permit synchronization on timber harvest plans between CAL FIRE, the water boards, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The goal is for the water boards and Fish and Wildlife to approve their permits within 5 working days of a timber harvest plan being approved by CAL FIRE. CalTrees, which is an online permitting system that is currently in the startup mode with full implementation, is expected to be in January 2019, and I think that will speed up the review process. We're seeing increased coordination between the Air Resources Board and the local air districts and CAL FIRE and the United States Forest Service regarding prescribed firework. I think the agencies, the air agencies get it. Far better to have prescribed fires than massive wildfires. And this issue is going to be discussed in depth at the Forest Management Task Force meeting on November the 19th. We have significant problems and challenges. We have a lack of infrastructure in the forest, for example, sawmills and bioenergy facilities. We have a lack of capacity, such as an adequately trained and available labor force. And the local organizations that we often rely on are reaching capacity to manage grants. There are choke points in the agencies, not enough staff with training to perform certain duties. We have the issue of the spotted owl, how to reduce impacts to species while enabling needed forest management work to go forward. We have faced at times vehement opposition to cutting larger trees, salvage logging in burned areas, and prescribed burning within certain ecosystems. How do we minimize the conversion of forest to shrubland and chaparral? That's going to be a continuing issue and problem, particularly in regard to global climate change. We have issues in terms of zoning in the WUI and increasing the numbers of residences in fire-prone areas. We need to be thinking about what additional legislation should we be considering when the new administration takes office, and what new regulations should be adopted. How to best facilitate the use of mass timber products in California will be a challenge in the near future. Later today, I'll be speaking at the Woodworks Mass Timber Symposium in San Francisco. As mentioned earlier, clearing vegetation from electric transmission and distribution line corridors to reduce wildfire risk is a issue, and there's a meeting this afternoon with the Public Utilities Commission here in the Resources Building on this important issue. And so in summation, I would say we have a lot of work to do, and time is of the essence. And, happy to take any questions from the board.
Member Andre.
Good morning, Terry. Yeah, that's an ambitious list and good list of things. In terms of the task force time frame, can you remind us or refresh our memories about how long the task force is going to stay together, and do you anticipate a smooth transition to a new administration with the task force going forward? I mean, Is there any reason for concern there?
I don't think so. I think that the transition regarding issues pertaining to forest health and wildfire prevention will be smooth. I think the new administration will be committed to that, given the concern on the part of the state's citizens and the support that this issue has enjoyed, bipartisan support in the legislature this year. In terms of the task force, in legislation this year, the task force is tasked for doing a number of things, preparing some reports, both in the time frame of July of 2019 and July of 2020. If my memory were better, I would be able to tell you those two exact things. But I think that's a clear indication that there's an expectation that the task force will continue. I will say that in discussions this year on legislation back in the July-August timeframe, it was certainly my belief, based upon comments that were made by members of the legislature and in particular their staffers, that they viewed the task force as basically a permanent fixture. So I think the task force will continue. I think one of the challenges of the task force is in the January timeframe to basically have a roadmap for the new administration, particularly in the short term in terms of the identifying the key issues that need to be addressed. Obviously, the new administration will, in relatively short period of time, decide on longer term goals and strategies. But I think they'll be in line with what we've been working on and considering here in the first 5 months of the existence of the task force.
I wanted to point out to the board members that there is a monthly meeting, there are subcommittees and so forth, but I've been attending the monthly meetings, and I will be again this November. There's a December meeting coming up where I'm going to have a conflict. I think it worked very well for us in the process on the state's forest carbon plan to have another member of the board try and sort of be engaged with the process simultaneously, so that wasn't just me. And I really thank member Andre for a lot of work. He and I were both very active participants in the forest carbon plan. So if you'd be thinking about it, in the way that I like to designate people on the board so that we're all, working as liaisons to different activities where we have special interest. If somebody is interested in being the second member, we never go to a third because of back of the key, but a second member that's engaged with me in coming to task force meetings in Sacramento, please let me know through Matt. Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to follow up a little bit, if you could elaborate a little on the efforts to achieve a portion of the goal of the 500,000 acres of national forest land that's being treated. How are we approaching that, and how strong are those ties to make that happen in the national forest system or federal lands in general?
Certainly. Well, anytime you have a discussion about forest issues in California, the elephant in the room is always the National Forest Service, with 50% of the state's forested land under their jurisdiction. I've had and been in quite a few meetings with the Forest Service, talking about issues in terms of how do we get more treatment on the land, prescribed fire, etc. I will say that I believe they're as dedicated to these issues as we are. They face a lot of the same issues and challenges that we face in terms of funding and staffing, etc. They're woefully underfunded, in my opinion. I think things will get better in a year when their budget is not reduced by the money they spent on firefighting issues. So they're going to have more money available, and that's going to help. And I think that we in the state are going to probably have to assume a greater burden, and there were discussions earlier this morning on master stewardship agreements and good neighbor authorities. We're going to need to implement those so we can step forward and take over some of the workload, both from the standpoint of money, given the amount of money that the legislature has allocated for this year and for the following 4 years. So we've got resources that we haven't had in the past. So I think we're going to have to, take over in certain areas a little more responsibility. That isn't excusing in any way in terms of the work they have to do. They're interested, obviously, in working closely with us. We're talking about how can we leverage our funds, and so that's important. We've been having meetings about how areas in the state that we need to focus on, and when that becomes clear, I think we'll have a better understanding of how we're going to be partnering with the Forest Service. But there's no getting around the fact that we've got significant challenges with resource constraints, and we're just going to have to do the best we can to work in partnership with them and try to increase their effectiveness while at the same time increasing their effectiveness.
Thank you.
I wonder if you have any comments for the board on your feelings about the kind of the degree to which we're now up and running at the subcommittee sort of level of the Forest Management Task Force. The agendas that are set, I have not reported back to the board on that personally.
Yeah, with any large grouping of government agencies, etc., there is you've got to overcome this inertia and get going, and so some of the working groups are further along than others. We've got a meeting with the regional groups coming up here in 2 or 3 weeks, I think, and that'll be the first meeting that they've had. The regulations working group has been, meeting for, 2 or 3, meetings now, and they're making good progress. So some of the groups are, trying to find their footing, but I'm overall I'm pleased with, the progress we've made, and I believe we'll start seeing the fruits of their efforts sometime in the beginning of 2019 in terms of recommendations to the task force. At every task force meeting, we have a report from the working groups, and so that provides, I think, some impetus and impetus for the working groups to increase the scale of their progress. So,
and any, I'm sorry, Member Chase?
Oh, I didn't mean to.
Go ahead.
Okay. Is certainly encouraged by your words about embracing, good neighbor authority and master stewardship agreements and whatever other mechanisms that encourage management on public lands. I agree with you. That is the elephant in the room. And I think if you can, be successful in that and increasing the acres and having a sustainable program, that's going to go a long way towards meeting some of your other objectives, i.e. increased wood utilization and restoring infrastructure in areas that currently don't have it, which then, is sort of self-feeding and enables additional treatments in those areas. Because what's going to drive that is not, decisions that are made in the boardroom in Sacramento. It's a consistent, sustainable supply of wood fiber off the landscape. And, the market will help determine what product is made from that. It could be any type of solid or engineered wood, but what will drive that is that sustainable supply that's what's going to spur the capital investment to increase, the infrastructure of the state. So, and I think a critical part of that is increasing the management on our public lands in California.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the comments I keep receiving over and over again from, folks on the industry side is that we need certainty and we need long-term contracts. So the Forest Service gets that. They have now, I think, the Master Stewardship Agreement, 20 years, and I've been told by Forest Service staff that they actually have the ability to go longer if necessary. That may be more difficult for them, but absolutely, there needs to be certainty for industry before they're going to make the investments that we need to be made to get more infrastructure in the forest. And the other thing I would say is that I had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman working for a regional conservation district. They've taken the bull by the horns and have, up in the Pitt River area, completed a couple of environmental assessments that they were partially refunded for the work they did by timber sales on previously burned areas. And when I mentioned the issue of lack of capacity on the local organizations, that's a critical issue, because a lot of the best work that's being done in our forests right now is being spearheaded by some of these local organizations, like the CHIPS organization in the Amador-Calaveras County area. And we've got to do more to encourage and foster those types of local organizations.
I wonder if either you or speaking for the director's office, any special desires for the board to engage with this process other than to sort of embrace the need to increase pace and scale?
Well, Chairman Gillis, first of all, I appreciate your attendance at the Forest Management Task Force meetings. And so the more participation I think we can have in that forum, the better off we're going to be. Because we want to use it as an opportunity to have dialogue and also to spread information and help generate ideas about what we need to do going forward. In terms of pace and scale, and that's obviously the challenge we face. I think generally I'm pretty satisfied with how things have gone in the last 4 or 5 months in terms of the allocation of resources on the part of the legislature. I would say that going forward, Chief Porter, mentioned this in his report in terms of prescribed fire. We've got to get a lot more prescribed fire on the landscape. And I note that CAL FIRE is getting 6 new prescribed fire crews in January. But I would say that agencies should not be bashful about identifying any resource needs and then working to supplement the resources we have, because really, as I said earlier, time really is of the essence, and we've got to do a lot more, and we've got to do a lot more quickly, and we should be bold in our aspirations. And my experience, having worked for the state of California for over 30 years, is that one of my takeaways is that bureaucracies tend to be too conservative. And the magnitude of this issue and problem is so great that we shouldn't be conservative.
Just to add. Again, Tom Porter, on behalf of the director. Related to that last question, Chair Gillis, about what can the board do to continue this, I think there are a couple of things that I'd like to make sure, and Member Andre asked the perfect question to segue into this as the first question to Terry O'Brien, which is what's the enduring nature of the task force? And I think if the board maintains some attachment to that task force, whether it's members visiting the working groups or actually the full meeting as appropriate and participating there, and then continuing to ask the question here and there of the forward-looking, and long-term need for this type of collaborative work. I think that is key. I think further, the rulemaking process that you're going to undertake related to the changes that came through 901, quickly moving through that process and then monitoring the progress that comes from those changes and determining if there are, as Terry mentioned, additional changes, legislative changes that we need to look for down the road in order to better support those forest land stewards and managers in doing the work they need to in an efficient manner. Because really still, while the Forest Service is the biggest single landowner, our biggest bang for our buck, if we can get them, is the small landowner that is currently not managing their land proactively. And so for us, in what we do, CAL FIRE outreach to those type of landowners, that's where we really want to expand our pace and scale, is to those landowners that aren't currently doing what they would like to do but can't economically undertake. And so that would help as well, and that's where the rule monitoring and determining if there are additional changes may help us as well. Thank you.
Final questions for Mr. Rose? Great. We're glad that we're doing this. From my point of view, we've been complaining to the legislature for as long as I've been in forestry that we didn't have resources to do the job. The legislature said, okay, show us, and throw some resources at us. So that chance is going to come around again in my career, so we have to make the best of this one. So look forward to working with you more on this.
Great, and thank you very much.
Great. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. We're going to move on to the report of the regulations coordinator, land use manager, and Mr. Diaz. Are you going to take this one from here?
I'm going to take this one from here.
Okay.
If that's acceptable. So the first piece, we're going to be splitting this between this discussion here between myself and Edith. I'm going to cover the first topic on the agenda, and then we'll transition over to Edith for the second point. So you will recall in Wenrico, September meeting, that we had a discussion as it related to potential permanency of emergency regulations as they related to trees that were damaged as a result of wildland fire around structured homes. And currently the board has two emergency packages, two emergency regulatory schemes that apply to that type of the removal of trees around the structures, but geographically they're different. The first piece that this board engaged in was emergency rulemaking for the counties of Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino. And when we had this discussion last month, the board ultimately made a decision to extend those regulations, those emergency regulations, and we had a discussion about permanency, and ultimately the discussion at that point kind of fell into the container of we want to use the existing regulations that we have, the existing emergency regulations, as a case study to get feedback to see if we would be able to adopt a permanent scheme that was more of a statewide type of scenario, not looking geographically distinct at the counties of Napa, Sonoma, or Mendocino, or in the second case, Trinity, Shasta, Mendocino, Butte, I think. I have to go back and look. So in the decision to move forward on extending the first set of emergency regulations for a period of 90 days, again geographically applied to the counties of Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino, the body, the agency, the board, essentially has indicated through that extension that you are considering permanent rulemaking, okay? Now this point of discussion that we're engaging in right now has come from some discussions that we as board staff have had with the Office of Administrative Law subsequent to last meeting. So we need to, given the fact that this extension has occurred under the authority, under your authority, and that extension by nature indicates that that this board is moving forward with a potential permanent rulemaking process, we need to re-engage in that discussion. And the Office of Administrative Law will ultimately have to have feedback from us as staff based on your decisions that permanent rulemaking is or is not being engaged in this particular instance. Is everybody following kind of where I'm going right now? So if you will turn your attention to tab 9 within your binder. You will find two, let me make sure that I'm fully accurate. You will find three particular pieces of documentation that apply to the rulemaking effort, in which is the emergency rule effort entitled Post-Fire Recovery Efforts from the counties of Napa, Sonoma, and Mendocino. So for the members of this board, you guys are familiar with the standard rulemaking process, and that standard rulemaking process is essentially the first step of that would be to authorize a 45-day notice of rulemaking text with a companion document of the initial statement of reasons. And when we send those documents out to the public, they were accompanied by a notice, right? A notice, a 45-day notice, if you will. So at this point, it is required that the board consider the approval of this initial statement of reasons and the authorization of the 45-day notice for permanent rulemaking. And I say you must consider it because that consideration can contain two separate actions. It can contain the action, or the action could be that you do authorize that 45-day notice, therefore indicating that this board is contemplating permanent rulemaking. Or it could contain, the action could be that you are not moving forward with a notice and therefore terminating the permanent rulemaking process, and the action of consideration of the initial statement of reasons and the rulemaking text, but denying the ISOR, that is the consideration, right? So the action could be we are not going to authorize 45-day notice, we are not going to approve the ISOR, but that indicates that consideration has occurred and would demonstrate substantial compliance with the APA as it pertains to emergency rulemaking or a permanency for backing emergency rulemaking. That's kind of a mouthful. We've never actually had to do this before because the level of discussion that we have had, as we had in Eureka, has been determined in the past to be substantially compliant. But it seems that there has been a change in the perspective on the way that this board has to act based on feedback from Office of Administrative Law. So, with that all said, before you have a notice, before you have an ISOR, that would be the companion document and be sent out as a 45-day, would be sent out with a 45-day notice along with the rule text. The rule text has not changed from the extended emergency rulemaking. And at this point, based on the recommendation or based on the discussions that we had in Eureka, my recommendation to you, again, this is based on last month's discussion, would be to take action to not approve the initial statement of reasons and to not authorize a 45-day notice, which would indicate to OAL through your minutes and through this agenda that substantial compliance with the APA has been completed, i.e. the due diligence of this board to contemplate permanent rulemaking has been completed. I know that's intricate, but that's kind of where it's at.
So, right,
Want me to restate the recommendation?
let's just say, I'm going to make a motion and hopefully get a second and move to discussion at the end. So, I would move that we direct the staff to notify the Office of the Administrative Law that we are not proceeding with permanent rulemaking at this juncture. And is there a second to that motion?
Second.
All right, so let's move to discussion on this. And let's start the discussion by saying, so Matt, what are the advantages in a concise exposition of our adopting or voting in favor of this direction of staff as recorded in our minutes?
The advantage would be that you would demonstrate as a state body that you have substantially complied with the APA as it relates to emergency rulemaking within the state budget.
And that within, the guidelines of administrative procedures, at some point, the board can come back to any action that it sets aside at a given time.
The board could contemplate permanent rulemaking for this type of activity at any time. That would be the permanent rulemaking through a standard practice.
Through a standard practice for permanent rulemaking.
Yes, and we will probably be having this discussion again in the near future as it relates to the second emergency regulations the board authorized not too terribly long ago, i.e. 1 month ago, with a different geographic scope. Yeah, but it is important to realize that the discussion we had last month was focused on case studies, right? Looking at the data associated with the use, the compliance, so on and so forth with this type of activity. And so we could return to this discussion for permanent rulemaking through the standard practice at any time.
Right. So, would anyone like to make any questions or comments in board discussion before I call the question? Member Chennai.
One question, it would only pertain to the counties originally mentioned in emergency notice.
Yeah, because there are two separate and distinct emergency regulations on the book right now. Geographically, this one we're discussing applies to these counties and is a year older than the other piece, which applies geographically to different counties. Well, actually one county in the same, but two separate counties, and is a year younger.
Member Willis.
I think when we have more information on how these emergency regulations have been used, we'll be in a better place to decide whether or not a permanent rulemaking is appropriate.
Wise comment.
So can I restate the motion one time for?
Please.
I would suggest that the motion is going to read that the board has not authorized approval of the initial statement of reasons and has not authorized 45-day notice of the companion rule text. Therefore, demonstrating compliance.
Correct. And with that clarification, I'd like to call the question.
Chennai?
Aye.
Dilbar? Aye. Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, so the next action will be introduced by Edith. And she will give you the background and staff recommendations as it relates to a project that she has been working on for conversation action.
I thought there were more emergencies to discuss.
So board members, I'd like to turn your attention to tab 9 in your binders. Just after the emergency rulemaking that you just discussed, you'll find a final statement of reasons and draft final statement of reasons and draft regulatory text for the SRA Fire Safe Regulations 2020 update. You authorized this rule text for 45-day noticing at your July meeting. It was published with the Office of Administrative Law on August 10th. The 45-day written comment period ended on Tuesday, September 25th. We received 4 letters in response to that notice, and then we received one after the deadline on September 30th. You had a hearing in Wairika on these regulations. There was no oral comment at the meetings, and based on your discussions, that there are no changes made to the rule text as it was noticed in its 45-day format. But based on your discussions in Wairika and based on your discussion around the comments that were received, I developed this final statement of reasons. And your discussion particularly informed the findings that start at the bottom of page 2 and go on to page 3 and 4, and then also in the responses to comments, particularly regarding the flexibility offered to local jurisdictions to develop individualized standards that have the same practical effect and meet or exceed the intent of the board's statewide minimum standards. So this is here for you for your potential approval of the final statement of reasons and adoption of the rule text in its 45-day notice format, I think.
So, I think what I would anticipate is doing here, we would need to approve the initial statements, or additional statements.
The final standard.
Final statement.
We produce more on approval of the final standard.
And then adopting the rulemaking text as a separate motion. So, I'm going to move that we approve final statement as distributed here. I thought it's quite responsive to the comments that we received. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Member Bussard. Board discussion on the motion. Hearing none, let's call the question.
Chennai.
Aye.
Delbar. Aye. Wheelis.
Aye.
Andre.
Aye.
Chase.
Aye.
Wade.
Aye.
Usari.
Aye.
Gillis.
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
I'll then move that we adopt the rulemaking text. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Member Chennai. Board discussion. Hearing none, let's call the question.
Chennai.
Aye.
Delbar. Aye. Wheelis.
Aye.
Andre.
Aye.
Chase.
Aye.
Wade.
Aye.
Usari.
Aye.
Gillis.
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. So now, representing the great power vested in me as chair of the committee, I'm going to wreak havoc on the agenda order. And we're going to jump ahead to item 12, the presentation of Francis Raymond Award. And I think this is one of the great traditions that we get to have at the board, where we're recognizing one of our community. The Francis H. Raymond Award recognizes individuals or organizations for outstanding contributions during the prior 5 years. So this is better than the Nobel, which is, in any point, to the protection and wide use of the forested resources of California. Francis Raymond was the state forester appointed in 1955, worked for the Division of Forestry for 40 years until retirement in 1970. Afterwards, continued his efforts on behalf of the field of forestry and resources protection more generally, lobbying for both the establishment of department status for the Division of Forestry, as well as be an outspoken proponent for the licensing of forestry professionals in California. As an acknowledgement of his accomplishments in that arena, he was issued RPF number 1 in 1973. And today we're recognizing Ms. Lois Kaufman for the Francis H. Vernon Award winner for this year. And most of the accolades will be delivered by others, but I just want to say it gets really tiring to hear Berkeley, Cal Poly, Humboldt all the time in this room, when we all know that the great forestry schools are all in the Midwest, and in particular Spartans, speaking as a Spartan, are an underappreciated resource on the West Coast. And with that, I turn to the
Apparently, go Michigan State.
Go Spartans.
Chairman Gillis, members of the board, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here to introduce this topic. Certainly, I've known Lois for a long time, and as you look at the nomination that was submitted for her, that time included my time as in CAL FIRE when she was toiling away under the Headwaters Agreement, and also then moved to the Shasta Trinity. But really the closest I've been, and the most time I've spent with her most recently, is the California Tree Farm program, which is dedicated to family forests and has an emphasis on family forests. I'm not going to go too much into that, because I really would like to introduce those who are here to talk about Lois and the contributions to her contributions to forestry. And I think as we look at this, thinking about small, non-industrial family forest landowners, that really has been a passion of Lois for quite some time. And as you listen to these speakers, I'm sure you'll get a thread for the contributions that she has made to that group, and probably will continue to make as we move forward. We have a number of people here today. I'd like to introduce Britta Ristad, who basically took bull by the horns and put together the nomination form. I imagine most of you have that in your packet. Quite an effort on her part, and I really do appreciate her taking up time and making the effort to put together a thorough nomination form. I learned things about Lois that I never knew, particularly the Lewis nickname, but we won't go too far into that. But I'd like to introduce Britta. I'd like to talk a little bit about why she nominated Lois and her contributions to her.
Thank you, Bill. Hello, members of the board. My name is Britta Restad, and I'm an RPF from Humboldt County, and the key party responsible for nominating Lois Kaufman for the Francis H. Raymond Award. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share with you my motivation behind the nomination. When I first read the description of the award, Lois immediately came to my mind as somebody who has not only exemplified excellence in forestry in the past, but who continues to contribute to California forestry in the present. Lois was fresh in my mind since I had seen her a few months earlier in the annual tree farm inspector meeting in Humboldt County. And there she dished out our annual inspections, cracked a few jokes, and then she introduced us to the new tree farm partnership program, My Sierra Woods, and explained her role in coordinating relationships with consulting foresters, loggers, and other funders to create a cost-free landowner assistance program to combat issues facing beetle and drought-stricken privately owned forests. And though the program was not offered in Humboldt, I was so excited about it because Lois was so excited about it. And I know she hadn't created it all on her own, but it was so clear to me that Lois is doing everything she can to fix forestry issues, even in her retirement. So it was her energy and involvement in My Sierra Woods that kind of stemmed my inspiration to nominate her. And I felt largely unprepared to tackle the nomination because I hadn't known Lois for very long. But luckily, Lois has friends in every corner of California, and I received overwhelmingly enthusiastic support for her nomination from everyone I contacted. So this daunting task soon turned into just a total pleasure listening to the stories about Lois in the woods. And I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to the nomination, and especially thank Dan Cahoon, and Bill Snyder, and Claire McAdams for their encouragement through the process. And it looks like there's a couple of copies of the nomination in case you haven't seen it, but it includes a background of Lois's accomplishments from her early days in the Forest Service and private industry to her career climbing the ladder at CAL FIRE. And it also contained 11 letters of support from colleagues, foresters, small landowners, friends, and mentees from 3 different states. And then it's concluded with several articles that Lois wrote herself, articles about Lois, and then proof of her involvement in Tree Farm, CLFA, the Buckeye Conservancy, and Forest Landowners of California. And the more I learned about Lois, the more parallels I drew between she and Raymond. And ultimately, they both dedicated their careers to the state and continued to serve its people and forests long into their retirement. And both are clearly forestry champions of their own making. However, I think it's important to recognize that Lois was able to do all this and more, starting her career in an industry fraught with gender bias, and she clearly stands as a role model to young women in forestry. So I'm overjoyed that the committee selected Lois for this award, and I really don't think there's a better way to honor Frances Raymond than recognizing Lois. Thank you.
And thanks to Britta for putting this nomination form together. As you read through the nomination form, I'm sure you looked at the many varied cross sections of Lois's forestry career, and then one of those was her phase with CAL FIRE, and certainly looking at her CAL FIRE experience, particularly as it related to rollout and implementation of some of the early headwaters forest timber harvesting plans, and trying to get all of that engaged and working. It was a big lift, and I think she was an asset to the Humboldt unit in terms of getting that put together and working in the field. I think we have Jim Robbins here today from the unit. Jim has been in the unit a long time himself, and certainly worked with Lois on the forest practice side, was mentored by Lois on the forest practice side, and I think is now working in state private forestry as a forestry assistant specialist, and has been trained by Lois relative to the Fancy Forest Tree Farm program. But I think Jim's here to say a few words on Lois's behalf in support of the nomination as well.
It's a pleasure to be here today and address the board. When Britta contacted me about this nomination, I thought, oh my gosh, of course. And I've known Lois for over 20 years, having worked for the department for 19 years. When I started as a Forester 1 in Humboldt Del Norte unit, I had the pleasure of working with Lois. She was one of the Forester 2s, and we had some very difficult times with the department. And the thing that was amazing about Lois is just her charisma and confidence. And that just shines through in everything she's done over her career. She first started with the department in 1981 as a forestry aide on the Latour State Forest. In 1988, she became a permanent member of the department, and she worked her way up from a Forester 1 to the Deputy Chief of Resource Management in the Shasta Trinity unit. I think the thing that's really valuable is the work she's done the last 5 years with the American Tree Farm System. And so as a forestry assistant specialist, I'm working with small landowners on a daily basis. And we need to keep them invigorated and energized and moving forward. What happens though is that with the regulations and all the different opportunities that are out there, they really need guidance. And so Lois is really providing that connection between the small landowners and all the possibilities out there for them. So I'm really excited to speak today and appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jim. We're not done yet. We have a lot of people. The next speaker, George Gentry, probably many of you know. George wears a number of hats these days, very active with the California Licensed Foresters Association, California Forestry Association. And George has known Lois for a long time as well, and he wants to say a few words on her behalf as the nominee.
Lois has a great sense of humor, and she's punked me a couple of times, so the temptation is to return the favor. But I'm not going to do that. But I do want to give you an example of her sense of humor. We were out on a PHI, and her approval and everything is really important to me. And so we're a couple hours in. She gives me the old, hey. So I'm like, shit. I go over and I got the whole, yeah. And she goes, I'm going to have to cancel the PHI. Oh. Why? And she goes, well, I'm really bored, and if you're not going to show me any landslides or anything, I'm just going to recommend approval. So like, oh, geez, you had me going, Lois. You really had me going. But that's the kind of person she is. She has a great sense of humor. And when I think of Frances Raymond, I think about somebody that embodied the profession, the champion for the profession. And Lois's whole career, I've known her 30 years, I've seen her champion the profession, whether she was working for CAL FIRE or after she worked for CAL FIRE. I've seen her mentor countless people to become foresters. To me, that's the embodiment of the profession. Lois was a forester before all you CAL FIRE people with all your fancy rigs. Lois was driving a green Ford Courier that was falling apart on the ridge tops, and she didn't care. She was a forester through and through. And to me, I can't think of a more worthy recipient for this honor. Thank you.
As we look at Lois, she's also been very active. She is a forest landowner herself. She's a member of Forest Landowners of California. She's participated in a lot of meetings, the Buckeye group up in Humboldt County. But when we reached out to the forest landowners, they also were very enthusiastic in their support. And pleased to have Fran Belden here, whose husband George, some of you may have known. And George was key to the tree farm program for a number of years as well. And Fran and Lois have enjoyed a special relationship through Forest Landowners of California. And it's really a pleasure to have Fran here today to talk on behalf of Lois.
Good morning. Thank you for honoring Lois and for inviting all of us to speak on her behalf. Having been married to George Belden for 12 years, before he passed away, I was introduced to Lois when he asked her if she would take over the responsibilities of being the administrator of the California Tree Farm Committee from us, after doing the work for 5 years. She accepted, and I helped train her in the position along with George. Currently, I am on the board of Forest Landowners of California and their liaison to the California Tree Farm Committee. I own a 160-acre tree farm growing ponderosa pine in Siskiyou County, and Lois is my RPF inspector, and who will be conducting the third-party inspection this past summer, and she did it, to determine if I'm following California forest practices, which will qualify my wood when harvested as certified. And I passed the test. So. For approximately the last 6 years, I've watched Lois take on the duties of administrator, and she has done an outstanding job in carrying them out. She has successfully delegated those responsibilities that she was doing, in addition to her own, to those who should be doing them. She puts out a monthly newsletter. She facilitates field days in conjunction with Forest Landowners of California, FLC. She applies for and receives grants from American Tree Farm System to benefit the California Tree Farm Committee and Forest Landowners of California annual meeting. She maintains the database for the tree farmers in California and collects dues. She secures donations for California Tree Farm Committee from the forestry industry. She attends the leadership conference meeting annually for ATFS, and she bakes the best brownies, which she brings to our meetings. Now, this last meeting we had was right after Halloween. She brought in severed Forester's fingers. She had a red dye on one end and a funny, yeah. So they were delicious, however. Lois is a wonderful friend, is married, and loves Basset Hounds, of which she owns one, Edith Ann. She and her husband also own a tree farm in Oak Run, where they have their home. She and her husband are both RPFs and were employed by CAL FIRE prior to their retirement. Sincerely, Fran Melvin. Thank you.
Well, I had invited Tom Fry from American Forest Foundation to speak, and we chatted briefly at a meeting we had in Reading a couple weeks ago, my Sierra Woods, and unfortunately he couldn't participate today, but he did talk to Senior Vice President for AFF, who basically operates the American Tree Farm System all along, and I did send this letter along. It says, the Francis H. Raymond Award recognizes the exceptional contributions of an individual organization to the protection and wise use of the forest resources in California. Spotlighting outstanding performance in management, research, education, and promoting public awareness of forest resources. Few individuals better epitomize these qualities than Lois Kaufman. From her seasonal work for CAL FIRE in the early 1980s to her retirement to leading the California Tree Farm System, Lois has been a truly tireless advocate, not simply for forests, but for people. Her efforts to empower family forest landowners to do right by their land, and in so doing can contribute to the indispensable role that forests play in our daily lives, is particularly commendable. She is an invaluable resource to everyone around her and an inspiring leader. The art and science of forestry in California is better off for her contributions. We are grateful to Lois for her dedication. And this is signed on behalf of Paul DeLong, who is the former state forester for the state of Wisconsin and now the Senior Vice President for AFF in charge of the American Tree Farm System. And I guess it's my turn to say a few words on behalf of Lois. Lois and I think, come to know each other more closely over the last 2 or 3 years. I think, I've been chairman of the Tree Farm Committee for a long time now, and certainly watching the evolution from sponsorship of the California Forest Association and other organizations when ultimately George took the program over, and Lois then took it over in his stead. I think the program really has benefited from her efforts over the years. And I say that because as I look at Lois, I look at a leader who basically can lead from behind. Her role as a mentor and trying to get people, particularly in a voluntary organization, engaged and interested in taking up the mantle and carrying on the work and getting word out is important, and it's a role that she does well. She leads from behind. Sometimes it's like a boot, but sometimes everybody needs a swift kick. But she also leads from ahead. She really thinks critically about private landowners. She's a landowner herself. She sees the struggles that people have, and I know the board has been very engaged in trying to work on solutions to the complexities that forest landowners encourage, particularly small forest landowners encounter when they're trying to get through the regulatory process. It is pretty daunting, and certainly Lois understands that well. And she is an advocate for simplification of things. And I think the other two things that have been of particular importance over the last 5 years is her shepherding us into a fully certified program. So we are, within the international context, a certified program. When we certify a landowner and their tree farm, we are saying that they meet the standards internationally for sustainability and for management practice. And that's been a big lift for us to take on. It's another area where Lois has led from behind. It's kind of pushing us forward, something we needed to do. And I think through her efforts, both kind and nagging, we finally got there. So that's good. And I think people have talked a little bit about My Sierra Woods, and we're now working toward our third generation of My Sierra Woods. And within that context, I think Chief Porter talked about the need for partnerships to expand capacity to get the word out to small landowners and to get them engaged. And certainly now My Sierra Woods, as an effort that will be overseen by American Forest Foundation, is one of those ways to do that. And I think this next phase is looking at doing outreach to over 10,000 landowners with the objectives of having almost 32,000 acres of fuel treatment accomplished through those efforts in Northern California, which is huge when you think about it. And most of that will be done through private initiative, through cooperation with the agencies and other people. And we're also hoping through that effort to facilitate getting landowners engaged in reforestation of 8,000 acres. And we're not going to have any trouble finding 8,000 acres of burned over forest land. And I think the My Sierra Woods effort is going to be focusing on trying to get those acres and landowners engaged in replanting and getting those lands productive again. So there's a lot of things that Lois brings to the table. And it really is my pleasure now to introduce Lois. I think she might want to say a few words, and then I'll turn it over to Chairman Gillis for the board itself. Thank you.
Good morning, board members, go Spartans. Little did I know when I came out here as a student referral to fight fire for the Forest Service that I was embarking on the career of a lifetime. It's a joint effort. There's a lot of people that I have to thank to get me to where I am. It's not just one person. It's all the great people I worked with, and it's all the jerks too. But we won't go into those folks. Since retirement, the American Tree Farm System, who I've been an inspector for since 1988, has been my passion, along with my husband, Dave McNamara, who I did not change his last name when we got married, so that's one of the differences. We've had a great time with this organization. They're a great small landowner organization, and they helped me to get where I am today. For someone who hadn't been west of Pittsburgh when I came out here, and put my name on a ride board as a student referral for my econ professor, rode out here in a Vega with two people I did not know and a shedding Brittany Spaniel. Lost all my traveler's tickets in Reno when I caught the bus. And if you've never been to California and you're from the East Coast, all you think of is the redwoods. If you've ever taken the bus ride from Reno to Alturas, it is not the vision that you have of California. I wondered, what have I gotten myself into? I can't go home because I have no money. I'm stuck. So this is the beginning of my career, my career of a lifetime. Well, I was wrong. It wasn't a career of a lifetime. It was my career for a lifetime, and I'm not done. So I really thank you for this award. I really appreciate it, and we're going to continue to move forward. Thank you.
On behalf of the board, you're a wonderful representative of what Francis Raymond stood for. It's always a joy to hear what our award winners have accomplished on behalf of the forestry community. And we're delighted to present you with the certificate recognizing the honor. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And one more.
You can go first. Go first. We're gonna take a picture with the whole board for you.
Oh, okay.
So if the board members could come down.
Really?
Based on your CV.
Graduated this year. Oh, I'll put this this year. 76.
Oh, no, 2 years ahead. Yeah, 2 years behind you. I graduated in 78.
Seven. Yeah, really small.
Yes, right in the middle.
So put you right,
The short one in the
stand
middle.
right on top of Rich Wade's feet.
And a couple more.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Actually, yeah, let's put the women in the middle. Let's say, let's say forestry's changing. Right?
Well, you're the tall
One, two, three. I'm gonna take a few. 1, 2, 3. And one more. 1, 2, 3.
Congratulations. The board will be in recess till 5 minutes after. Take a break. I'd like to call the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection back to order. And on with the business of the board, with report of standing committees. And I'm going to turn first to Member Wade for a report from the Forest Practice Committee.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Gillis. Forest Practice Committee met yesterday. We had 4 items on the agenda. The first was a report of the effort by the department with respect to its study of exceptions and emergencies. We heard from Drew Coe in that regard. He basically updated us on a fairly extensive report that he had provided us in Wairika in September. Basically just asking for more input about monitoring and what they might want to monitor. So it's a good brief report, very good. He had lots of slides too that I think would be available to board members to respect to some of the further data processing they've done and what they were looking for in terms of future input from us. Secondly, we did get into our task of examining the 1038 exemptions in light of our direction of SB 901. We did take full advantage, I think, of the 2 workshops that we had because we had a nice distillation of points that had been decided versus those that still needed further discussion at the committee. So I thought that worked really well. We did spend quite a bit of time actually on the details as is typical in a committee hearing like that or a committee proceedings that way. But we did make our way down, and so make our way down this matrix that board staff had provided with respect to the demands of 4584.1, which is the new listing of all the potential things that could be required of exemptions, the whole array of exemptions, but the board has the discretion to not require them for any particular exemption. So it's a relatively complex matrix when one thinks of the mapping requirements alone. There's 14 individual itemized requirements that could or could not apply to, you know, to all the exemptions that we have on the book. So in that regard, the board, the workshops the staff undertook, I thought were extremely useful. We got through most of that type of material. So we will continue, as was mentioned, we will have another workshop scheduled for sometime between now and the December meeting, and hopefully continue to further that along and get through that deliberation about how we're going to apply potentially the new regulations of SB 901 to our exemptions. Next, we spent some time on the northern spotted owl issue, and the item on the agenda was to try to focus in on back to the problem statement. Board staff had solicited input from stakeholders that had participated on the field trip in Wairika. And so they had compiled not only individual comments of many people that responded to that, but also had itemized those into half a dozen or so various problem statements and potential board actions, or to the degree that the board could respond to that directly or indirectly through maybe assisting with or forming a catalyst to get other agencies to take action on particular focused topics. So,
if I could interrupt you there, Wade, just for a second for a question for Mr. Diaz. A number of these comments were received from people who are employed by various agencies, but this set of comments doesn't constitute, if I'm correct, any sort of a formal comment that we might need to respond to in the context of any later work we might deal with addressing the NSO issues in the state.
Yeah. The comments that were received, it was a discussion. The persons that were solicited were put together, I don't know this by myself, focused on persons that were the most vocal during the field tour, and also looking at who they would represent. So looking from wildlife biologists all the way to various agency representatives, we compile the comments. We do not need to respond to them. It was simply to try to solicit comment from members of this board, members of the persons that participated, and try to use that as a means to compartmentalize the potential problems that exist for NSO, and then try for us as board staff to try to offer solutions that the board could take in response to the identified problems. But this is not a rulemaking process. This is just a public stakeholder input to try to feed the decisions of the committee and ultimately the board.
Or stakeholder input, because some of them are members of the public.
Right. It was across the board. It was members of the public, agency staff, everybody. Anybody and everybody that was kind of vocal at that.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's fine. Please go ahead. Clarification of that. So we will continue that process of addressing potential problems, focusing on problems next month. So using the document that board staff compiled based on those comments. And lastly, we just touched briefly on a draft letter that would address the use of heavy equipment in WLPZs as an in-loop practice. So it would be an effort that would be non-regulatory in nature, would be in the form of a letter from the board to the department to advise them of our interest in having that be a tool that can be utilized by landowners to help reduce fire, primarily reduce fire danger. So that really didn't receive any discussion at all substantially, just pointed out that the letter existed and could be reviewed further next month. So there were no actionable items coming out of the board. Do other members have any other comments to add?
No, as soon as we can get that next workshop scheduled, I think it would be good to get that date out so people can set a calendar. I think we're making good progress.
I could then call on you, Member Andre, for report from Forest Management.
Okay, Management Committee met with myself, Chair Gillis, and Member Chase. We have one actionable item. I'll just start with that one. We have 3 items on the agenda. The actionable one pertains to the last item, review of the board policy 0353 regarding nurseries. And last month in Wairika, I think we'd moved a draft amendment or revised policy pretty close to completion, and then we received a comment that the letter was going to be prepared. And it was, and we received that from Cal Forests, a large nursery in Etna. And that provided the impetus for some additional revisions to our policy. But I think right before you have a hard copy of our final product. Board policies are adopted upon Board of Forestry approval, so it doesn't go to any noticing following today's action. So I'll just say there's a track changes version in there, and this is the final copy, and the committee members feel like we were responsive to some of the comments and input and wordsmithed it a little bit and feel like it's ready to go. So I'll make a motion to adopt the nursery policy 0353, the updated version.
I'll second.
And
all right, for discussion of the motion.
I have a question. What was the input or concern from Cal Forest Nursery, the private nursery?
Well, there are letters in the packet.
But I think you could concisely say it was, in some cases, it's just very constructive about whether or not our intent was clear with the language we were providing, whether or not there should be an emphasis, a greater or lesser emphasis on native species or restoration work, or treatment of non-natives. Some good comments on the interface between the public and private sector. I think that really, that was most of it. I think a lot of it was the public-private sector interface. And then the discussion we had, I think, yesterday was quite constructive. The way we had developed the nursery policy, I think we had not necessarily articulated the investments that the state had made in the seed bank operations, because this was primarily about the nurseries. And so yesterday was quite useful, I thought, in getting the information out about the substantial work apart from the issue of restarting nursery operations that had been done on the seed banking operations that are so critical to activities across the state.
I think that's exactly right, emphasizing that key and unique role that the state can play in seed collection, storage, and particularly of some of the non-commercial species, or that's an essential role that the state needs to play.
So we highlighted that or underscored that in the policy. And, they did attend the meeting too, not only wrote a letter, but came down and they participated yesterday. So it was constructive.
With respect to the discussion on native seedlings, we didn't want to tie the state's hands. We wanted to give them maximum flexibility to pursue potential seed stock that may come from outside of California in light of climate change and other factors, we want to give maximum flexibility while still recognizing the importance of maintaining native species in the state. So we sort of made that distinction and dropped the native qualifier on with respect to seed and seedlings, but left it with species.
But that would be, the preference would be, I mean, if at all possible.
I think the preference was clear in there. We just didn't want to wire something into a policy like this. The board revisits only infrequently, that would actually have some problematic statement in it later relative to the state's need to respond to climate change.
Thanks.
Yeah, we would not have made the proponents of the advent of scientific agriculture like Jefferson happy with our unwillingness to consider what new plant from Africa or Asia we should cover the state with.
Matt, I do have, I found one very minor typo in number 7 on page 2. Seedling, the last word in that paragraph there, seedling, should be plural, should be seedlings. And that was one of the areas that was edited after comment.
That was buried in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So I think the mover of the motion would accept that editing as a friendly amendment to the motion.
Yes.
And so with the seconder, since the seconder wanted to.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Other questions or comments on the motion? Hearing none, let's call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Gelbar?
Aye.
Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
Okay, other item we discussed was the potential revision, or, revisions of stocking standards within 913. This is a big deal item, and there's been some comment letters regarding this, and there is some information that will be informing, what to do in the future on revision of stocking standards, which have pretty much been in place since the 70s, minimum stocking standards. So our homework and our likely progress for next month is to hone down the problem statement. We have a draft in the binder, and committee members will be working on that, revising that, and then looking in the future for potential regulatory revisions. One interesting thing, within statute this year. It enabled the board to have some latitude on stocking standards and also to define things like forest health, ecological goals, that would be what we would ground our revisions on. And, there's discussion about having RPF, I wouldn't say in lieu, but site-specific prescriptions based on certain, criteria for revision. But it's, basically part of the problem is the successful thing, and that it kind of relates to the last item, the stock. The seedling stock is a higher quality these days, and there's a high survival rate on reforestation. So part of the problem is overstock stands based on, 30, 40 years ago, there was like a 40, 50%, I guess, in terms of reforestation success, that was considered good. Now it's 90, more likely. So anyway, you'll hear more from the committee on this item. We're going to carefully kind of map the future here with this one, so that we can take advantage of information like the William Main project and other research, so that we have really something to build our, potential regulatory changes on. So, no action on that one. Any other committee members want to?
No, the other is the reforestation manual. Is due to come out at the end of the year, so that and the report from the William Main group will
inform this discussion.
So what is the main one we're working on? Should be end of the year, my expectation. Member Andre, or I'm sorry, Member Wade.
It might be worth mentioning that this subject had been in the Forest Practice Committee earlier this year, and so if folks are looking for that in Forest Practice Committee, it has been shifted to Management Committee, so people are tracking that. We're talking about the same issue.
And we expect a joint meeting at some point, I believe, with this as we do our work and, and then join back up with Forest Practices on it. And a workshop as well. And the last item was discussion of potential, updates to the non-industrial timber management plan. The committee directed staff to work on an ISOR for this. The potential, it's amendments to the NTMP. Amendments, I think we're pretty much in agreement on where we are with that. There's one issue regarding bringing in the designated agents and how that there might be some redundancy with the timber landowner when it's one and the same, so we don't have a situation where the agent has to write a letter to the landowner who's this, we don't want to create any extra loops. So we're going to work on that for the next month and bring that back. I'd probably bring it back in December or January for action, for noticing as well. And in the next month, I'll be meeting with our executive officer on adding additional items to our committee's agenda, priority items. Since we were able to knock one off today.
Great. And let's turn to Member Husari for resource protection, and I think we've got a lot to go through for you.
Well, we do have quite a bit. Actually, there's an entire binder. And so if you could go to binder number 2, that contains everything that we went through yesterday for the Resource Protection Committee. I was the only committee member in attendance, but Member Lewis was homesick, but she was listening, and so that was great. We had quite a bit of attendance, a big group from the CAL FIRE Land Use Planning team, which were really involved in these efforts, so that was very helpful. So we'll just go through, and Edith's going to be pretty involved in this. We'll go through the binder, and it's in the order of the topics on the agenda. About the first 2/3 of the binder are safety element reviews. And we had representation from the land use planning team for each of these safety element reviews. Members of the team have coordinated with the local government entities and over a long period on these safety elements for the County of Shasta, the County of Tuolumne, City of Rancho Santa Margarita, City of Rancho Palos Verdes, and the City of Colton. So for each of these, the first thing, of course, is the checklist, and we went over those with the responsible parties from CAL FIRE. And basically, we had representation from the County of Shasta. The new, Edith, what was the gentleman's name? I have it written down, but I don't have it right here. We had a
Was that Mr. Hellerman?
Yes, who explained to us that for a number of reasons, the County of Shasta worked with CAL FIRE, but for a number of legal reasons, they won't be doing the update fully of the safety element until next year when they do their housing elements, but they plan on using the services of CAL FIRE, the planning team, extensively in the unit to bring this up to speed. It requires quite a few changes because of what's happening in Shasta County with the fires and running. And, but it was great, we had representation from the county. The rest, all the other ones, the county of Tuolumne, the 3 cities, there had been a lot of back and forth with Randy's planning team, and the documents are actually in great shape. Really pleased to see that. And what's really exciting about the whole process, and you can read all of them if you would like, I mean, is that they're all getting much better in how they address fire concerns. The reason being that there's a lot of coordination and back and forth. And so the documents in general are much improved. Now, we don't have an actionable, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do think that we're making progress because of the CAL FIRE staff and also just a lot of the coordination. So unless you'd like to talk more about those, I think we'll move to the last third of the binder. Is that okay with everybody? The next item is of course, the matrix for fire safe regulations certification status. And we did have an actionable item there potentially, which is looking at the Plymouth County efforts. And in going through that, we had Plymouth County come in before, and they had worked quite a bit with Edith. And at this point, we reviewed the entire thing. There's another matrix, of course, Excel spreadsheet that goes through all the things in Plymouth County's ordinances that deviate slightly from the fire safe regulations. But we determined that they all meet or exceed. There's no need for them to make any other changes. Edith's already talked to them quite a lot, and I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at it. But I would recommend that we go ahead and certify these as meeting or exceeding. So I can make a motion to that effect? Okay, and so the motion is that we certify Plymouth County Ordinance 2008-114 as meeting or exceeding the SRA fire safe regulations.
Second.
Seconded by Member Lewis. For discussion. Hearing none, let's call the question.
Chennai?
Aye.
Delbar? Aye. Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
And I have to say that between your efforts, Usari and heroic efforts, Ms. Hannigan and Chief Muñoz's folks, it feels like you have this down to a science, and I think you're doing great things in bringing this process up to speed in jurisdictions across the state. I've had one of those things where this will pay big dividends, even if you can't point in any specific instance to where this has saved the house or reduced the cost of fire suppression. The net effect is going to be tremendous as we move through this process. And it's great to see it happening so expeditiously.
Well, it's great to work with the Landy's planning team, and Edith, of course. Yeah, she cracks the whip. Anyway, the next thing on our agenda was to review the existing board fire protection policies. And there is a draft in the binder. However, I took a look at it. I think it's very well written, but I think it's one of those things where it would be best to have more than one committee member present, and especially since Member Wheelis was so involved in the strategic fire plan. So we're going to defer any action on that. And also, Member Los Huertos also had some comments that that he is in the process of incorporating. So we decided to move that to the next meeting of the RPC for a lot of good reasons. But that'll give you a chance to go over it for the next meeting, and we'll also be working on it, but maybe by the next meeting we'll be ready to proceed with that. So we didn't talk, did we? We didn't talk about land use planning directives from the, no, we did. We
Yeah,
did talk about the land use planning directives from the 2018 legislative session, and Edith gave us an update on the work ahead for the RPC. And particularly, this is number 4 on our agenda, particularly the workshops that we will be putting forward possibly for the entire board on land use planning issues. And the reason being that applying the SRA fire safe, something like the SRA fire safe regulations to LRA is not a simple thing. To take those sorts of regulations and start to bring them into local responsibility areas. So Edith feels, and I agree, that we really need some workshops on that topic. It's a short part of our direction, but a very complicated thing, especially when you start to apply to LRA throughout the state. So that leads us to the 4 possible, the 4 draft regulations and draft initial statement of reasons for 4 regulatory efforts. And in consultation with the executive officer, we found that we need to address those separately, one at a time. And Edith's going to lead us through them. I'll tell you they're short because she has split this stuff up into digestible chunks, easily digestible chunks, as I would put it. And the reason for this is that they come out of SB 1260 and Assembly Bill 2911. And Edith's done quite a lot of work. Maybe we should just give her more things to do so that she gets a lot done. So there's 3. And if you go to your binder, the first one that we're going to talk about is the very high fire hazard severity zone adoption. And Edith will lead us through that. It's about, it's like the last 1/5 of
RPC 5A.
Pardon?
RPC 5A.
5A, there you go. So let's do them one at a time, and we'll start with this one. We went through them, and I'm pretty comfortable with the first 3 as far as, and so were the land use planning staff who were there, and the other staff who were there. They've been real involved. So let's go through them and see where we want to go with them. The first 3, the 4th one we're still working on.
Okay, good morning still, Chairman, members of the board. To give you some context, like Member Husari just discussed, these sets of regulations are all as a result of pending changes to statute as a result of SB 1260 and AB 2911, which were signed by the governor this past fall. We are trying to get these sets of regulations authorized by the board for 45-day noticing as soon as possible, just to clear them off our plate to deal with some of these larger, potentially more controversial issues that we'll be facing in the next couple of years as we try to implement other sections of those bills and of SB 901. So just to give you an idea of timelines, my goal is to have these authorized by you by the end of this year so that I can bring them to the Office of Administrative Law on January 2nd, since the sections of statute won't be effective until then. So we're kind of doing this pre-work ahead of time. And then the ultimate goal is to get these to the Office of Administrative Law in their final form, the entire rulemaking package in April or May for a July 1, 2019 effective date. And then we can kind of put these aside and then focus on things like the changes to PRC 4290, the addition of 4290.5. Like Member Husari said, in the spring we'll also be having some workshops for the full board focused on land use planning issues. Right now I'm tentatively working on putting together one in Oakland or the East Bay area, and then a few down in Southern California where there's a lot of LRA, very high fire hazard disparity zones. So clear your calendar and stay tuned. So this first set of regulations in front of us implements a revision to Government Code Section 51179C put in place by SB 1260. What that revision does is it takes it requires a local jurisdiction when they adopt the local responsibility area, very high fire hazard disparity zone maps that are designated by the director. This new revision now requires them to submit that local ordinance that's adopting those maps and the maps that they adopted to the Board of Forestry. And it's largely, I established some definitions. You can see those on page 1 of the rulemaking text. And I otherwise largely copied statute. And then I made a few clarifying changes. I also, I specified that the ordinances and the maps should be submitted electronically to the board. And then I put together some information so that the board could create a form if they wanted to collect kind of consistent data and information from each of the jurisdictions. So we don't necessarily have to implement that right now, but having that in regulation does mean that in the future, if we are deciding we want more information or we want consistently collected information from all these local agencies, the board can do that. So I have that rule text there in front of you and the initial statement of reasons following it, and I am available for any questions.
So if people don't have any questions about it, it's a fairly, this one is a fairly simple piece of regulation. If I'm prepared to make a motion, if you're ready.
Yeah, I personally, my main concern was the form in which the information is transmitted, and I thought the way that you structured this recognized that we're not all on the same page technologically. Ideally, this would not be a PDF, but I think it's well worded for how the information is transmitted. So I'm quite comfortable with the language and the justifications. So I would agree with that.
So I'm making a motion to approve the initial statement of reasons for the very high fire hazard severity zone adoption.
Second.
Second by the board. Board discussion on the motion. Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delbar?
Aye.
Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Husari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
So I have a second motion, which is to authorize the draft rule text for 45-day noticing for the very high fire hazard severity zone adoption.
Second.
Board discussion. Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delbar?
Aye.
Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade,
Aye.
Pusari,
Aye.
Gillis.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
So we're ready to move on to the second item, which is the safety element review. So we already have been reviewing safety elements. We just reviewed some of them today, but the change here is that there's a little bit more, there's more requirements for collaboration on the recommendations that we make. And that also comes out of the same legislation, SB 1260 and AB 2911. And so this, instead of being brand new, is basically some changes to the existing text. So Edith, would you be so good as to lead us through this one?
Yeah, so this delightfully short 2-page regulatory text adding in this new optional consultation that the board may request of and perform with a local jurisdiction if the local. So the way the safety element review kind of communication process works is I'll send back to the local jurisdiction the recommendations that Member Busari just discussed coming out of RPC. And then the local jurisdiction, if they decide not to accept some of those recommendations, they have to send a letter back to the board discussing why. Upon receipt of that letter, now the board may request a consultation with that agency to discuss why not they have not accepted those recommendations. This section of code sets that in motion and then sets time limits on when that has to happen. So I just revised a section of regulation that the board implemented, I think, in 2017 about this safety element review process. Again, I largely copied statute. The only change that I made, I think, or at least certainly one that has any type of significant regulatory change, is clarifying business days. So within 15 business days of the board receiving those reasons for not accepting the recommendation, that you have 15 business days instead of just 15 days, calendar days or something. And then I did the same thing with the fact that the consultation shall occur no later than 30 business days after the board's request. Since this consultation, this isn't just two government agencies writing letters back and forth to each other, since this is something that, we need to find a amenable time and place and, the right people in a room. I thought giving us a full 6 business weeks rather than 30 calendar days would be beneficial to both the local agency and the board. Otherwise, I just copied that new section of government code that SB 1260 added to put into your regulatory process.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I just want to make sure I understand. So the consultation takes place, and then the city or county can approve it after the consultation. But what are the results of the consultation aren't completely agreed upon? I mean, how can they take that step after the consultation takes place without something else being in there, like approval of the board?
That is an interesting question that the legislature continues to not provide an answer for in statute, or the authority for the board, unfortunately, to do anything about. So that's something that I've continued discussing with different legislative staffers who have taken an interest in this issue. Because before we would get, currently I should say, we get letters from local jurisdictions explaining why they might not have implemented some of our recommendations, and then that conversation kind of ends at that point. This doesn't necessarily, this helps continue that conversation between a local jurisdiction and the board about differences in implementing those safety element recommendations. And I'm continuing to work with legislators, or legislative staff, to see how we can kind of strengthen kind of the end result of those consultations and those communications that we're having.
I asked a similar question to Edith, and right now we agree to disagree.
Not us, the local jurisdiction of the board.
Yeah.
Oh.
Not Darcy and I.
Yeah.
No, sorry, thank you.
Yeah, we got the.
Yeah, sorry, that's what happens when you have a head cold.
Okay. Yeah, because in reading the regulation, it makes it look like, well, they could just satisfy that and be done with it, you know. That's just
Well,
routine.
it gives another opportunity for whoever the land use planning team member is working with them to go forward and have more discussions in addition to the board. I think it's part of a longer term process, but this is as far as the legislature was going to go, which is further than before. And this means that when we send a letter, there'll be communication about it and more discussion. I think that this is about as far as we can go, given.
Actually,
yeah.
I think in terms of public agencies, levels of government engaging in rational risk management, this is pretty good. More than just a recommendation. So I must admit that the executive officer and I did just go to the effort to affirm that telephonically is in fact working. Because I hadn't seen it before. But
I did the same before I copied this from
verified that, I'm
statute.
sure you did too.
Yep.
Well, I believe that comes straight out of legislation.
Yes.
So it is a word.
No, we verified it is a word.
It's become a word. So, are we ready for a motion? Okay. So I'd like to make a motion to approve the initial statement of reasons for the safety element review 2019.
Second.
Any more discussion on the motion? Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delbar? Aye. Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Dusari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
So I have a second motion, which is to authorize the draft rule text for 45-day noticing for the safety element review 2019.
Second.
Seconded again by Willis. For discussion of that motion. Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delbar?
Aye.
Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Dusari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
So we have a third possible action for the board. And I have a question for you, Edith, before I begin. Is this the correct title, the subdivision map findings?
Yes.
Okay. It's the other one that has a different title.
Yeah.
All right, so this is.
That we're going to change.
Right.
Yeah.
This is a third component of our regulations related to SB 1260 and AB 2911. It's a little bit more complicated, and it is brand new. It's not a revision to anything we already have going on. So I'll let Edith take you through this, and then we'll figure out whether we want to proceed.
Yeah, so this, I first want to make sure that everybody has the revised copy of these regulations. I made one change to align, I moved what was section D into section C and section C to section D. So you should hopefully have the track changes version in front of you. None of the actual regulatory text or ISOR text was changed, just the numbers.
I'm sorry, how would we differentiate?
I have red track changes. I'll do that.
Oh, well, we'll begin it right now. Edith basically has something that she hasn't. We just didn't pick it up.
You will shortly have in front of you the track changes version. So while that's getting handed out, this set of regulations has a little bit of a longer history than the other ones. Prior to, well, in the original bill that gave the board and CAL FIRE the basis for the land use planning authorities and programs that they now have in place, SB 1241 back in 2012, it had this component where a local jurisdiction making, dividing this, looking at a subdivision map, had to make 3 findings related to the application of Public Resources Code 4290, 4291, and whether or not that subdivision had adequate fire suppression protection from a local agency or CAL FIRE or fire district. The way that section of code, and that was an entirely new requirement, it was part of the Subdivision Map Act that had never been, these findings had never been required of local subdivision maps before. That requirement, we really liked it and we liked the concept, but it was a little bit contradictory, and it also made some of the board's regulations applicable to local responsibility areas in a way that the other authorities and Public Resources Code kind of didn't allow for. So in 2015 or so, we started having conversations with Senator Jackson's office about doing some cleanup on this section of code so that we could adequately implement it, so that we could feel confident about our authorities to implement it and what we were asking what types of findings we were asking local jurisdictions to make on their subdivision maps. And so we were working on that language with Senator Jackson's office, and then the 2016 and 17 fire seasons came, and SB 1260 started encompassing a lot of other land use planning things. And luckily we were able to keep this language in here. We're finally ready, I think, to have some regulations around these findings. So SB 1260 amends a section of the Subdivision Map Act, where now those findings have been consolidated into 2. We have some regulations in front of you. This first section on page 1 is establishing definitions, largely taken from other sections of statute to be consistent with the Subdivision Map Act and the Public Resources Code. Our second section is the subdivision map findings. And in the interest of reducing any kind of confusion, this entire section is pretty much entirely copied from statute, to establish that you have to make these 2 specific findings. And then the next section goes on to implement and make specific the requirement that a local jurisdiction has to send those findings to the board. There's some discretionary decisions in here. I established a deadline of 30 calendar days for the local agency to get these documents electronically to the board, that they're submitted electronically. The board could create a form to collect some information from the jurisdiction. This is particularly something I think the board might want to take advantage of in the future, creating this form, because the findings are supposed to be made based on a substantial evidence in the record. And I would imagine that as the board starts receiving these findings, with a sign-off about these findings and then the parcel map, you're going to want to know what was the substantial evidence that the jurisdiction relied on to make those findings. And so that's those set of regulations. This is something that myself and Pete Mignot and the land use planning team have been working on finessing and turning into something that the board can implement with transparency and clarity for a long time. I think having local jurisdictions have to make these 2 findings on their subdivision maps and provide us with this substantial evidence that they're designed and protected in a fire-safe manner is going to be potentially as, I think, groundbreaking in fire safety planning as our safety element review process. So I'm really excited about these, as much as you can be excited about regulations.
Just one question of curiosity, I think it looks great. Are there parallel requirements on commercialization, map decisions and so forth that require sort of attestations of adequate water supply or sanitation or transportation capacity? I mean, isn't this just adding the fire safety to a list of things which have to be documented to be supportable by the decision?
Yes, I think but I think it goes a little bit further than, I'm not an expert in other, findings per se, but you do have a map that has to be signed off, by sanitation or public works. But I think for here, the specificity of the compliance of PRC 4290 and 4291, I think makes this a much stronger part of this subdivision map process than potentially other findings and sign-offs that you have.
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me like bringing fire protection into the same board, but it's all these other elements of the service.
Yeah.
To develop, yeah.
Yeah, really elevating it.
And I was just gonna point out a couple things that confused me, just so you can be confused too. On page 2A, you'll see that it's just required for anything in SRA, so regardless of where it sits on the mapping. Then this is directly out of the language that's provided. Instead of saying anything about LRA, it just says, or a very high fire hazard severity zone. So that's basically any.
Location.
Yes, but that's what it says, so that's what we put in here. But this will become more important as we move on with the fourth piece, which we're not ready to do today.
What was that next? Can you point that out again?
Well, it says right here, it's line 9, so it's SRA or a very high fire hazard severity zone. And that means a very high fire severity zone anywhere. Yeah. And so they're moving along, this is kind of moving us towards what we'll get to in the workshops, which is the discussion of applying these 4290 to LRA, really. But this is the language we have, so that's what you've put in there. And I think the other thing that you need to know about it is that in order to send us the map, the jurisdiction will have had to already have their ordinances evaluated as meeting or exceeding. So anybody that hasn't been through that process will have to do that before. Yes, no, that's not true.
No, it's an option.
It's an option. Okay. Well, anyway, see, I didn't totally understand it, but in any event, I just thought I'd bring that up because those are the two things that stood out to me. But I am ready to make a motion about this one as well, if the board, if we're ready to have a motion.
I can offer some further elimination on both of those.
Okay, well, eliminate then.
Okay, well, unless you're ready to move on.
Would you like elimination from Edith on those two things?
Yeah. So, I don't understand it. I'm not going to pretend to understand it, but I'm going to do what the legislature says. For some reason in government code, the way the legislature talks about LRA very high is they just call it a very high fire hazard severity zone, and they define it in government code 51179I, and it's a very high fire hazard severity zone that is not an SRA. So you kind of have to do some mental gymnastics and kind of get that they're inferring that by saying very high fire hazard severity zone,
Right.
even though we have those in SRA, what they mean is LRA, very high. So I did try to make those connections by copying statute and then defining, linking those definitions in the definition section. I know that it sounds very strange, and I know we talk about LRA very high, but I didn't want to start kind of turning the way we colloquially talk about these things into regulation and then getting future fire safe planner generations confused about what areas we were talking about.
Is the fact that it's defined elsewhere why we're not treating it the way we normally do with defined terms in terms of capitalization? I mean, it's not a defined term in our set of definitions.
Yeah.
It's defined elsewhere.
Yeah, that, Eric Hedge, our regulations coordinator, and I have had some discussions about capitalization and definitions, and we haven't come to any conclusions about what to do with that in the fire protection regulations.
We adopted a format which made it difficult to crosswalk to
Yeah.
the parts of the regulatory code we don't write. That wouldn't be a great idea.
Yeah, that might be something that we should look into further to make sure that we're consistent with that.
But I think it's clear. I understand the linkage.
And then was the other thing the 4290 and the ordinances or something else?
No, I'm fine with that.
Okay, I thought there was something else.
So I'm ready to make a motion sorry, I got ahead of myself. That we approve the initial statement of reasons for the subdivision map findings.
Second.
Any further discussion on this? Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delmar? Aye. Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
So I have another motion that we authorize the draft rule text for 45 being noticing for the subdivision map findings.
Second.
Board discussion? Hearing none, please call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delmar? Aye. Wheelis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
All right, so we had a fourth topic, which is survey for adequate access, and the committee needs to talk about it some more. For one reason, if you turn to the last thing in your book, we need to have some discussion about how to evaluate what significant fire risk is, which is on line 16, RPC 5D, how to deal with coming up with some set of criteria that makes that a little bit more clear, or sets up a set of criterion for evaluating significant fire risk. We had a discussion over how we could do that. Some of it may involve getting FRAP involved, but we're just not ready to go to this piece of rulemaking yet. But we may be after the next meeting.
Are there any definitions of significant fire risk built into our zoning that we can draw in terms of designation of severity, woodbury,
Well, the problem is that fire hazard is different than fire risk.
Yeah.
And, I mean, so his risk has more to do with things like ignitions.
Right.
And less for, or persistent weather patterns. and less to do with fuel loadings. So the committee really needs to take more of a look at this. The other reason why we need some more time on this is that this is a requirement. You can read through it, but and Edith will correct me, that what we were required to do is ask that existing subdivisions, not subdivisions in the real estate sense, but subdivisions as in groups of 30 or more homes that already exist, if there's only one way in and out, that that local jurisdictions and CAL FIRE have the ability to require some kind of remediation to protect people that live there, and that can be one of several things, all of which are discretionary but could be quite expensive. So build another road, do some more fire hazard stuff, all that kind of stuff. So this one's going to take quite a bit of work. But as Edith will probably say now, it is discretionary. But some of it is identifying places where there is these groups of dwellings, where there is significant fire risk, and defining what fire risk is. And then the other thing is to flesh out this other component of what can be done. So that's our discussion, and we're not bringing anything forward to you on that. And do you have any more, Edith?
The only thing I would add is that these are regulations. So AB 2911 added section 4290.5 to the Public Resources Code. What that section requires the board to do is, in consultation with the fire marshal, by July 1, 2021, survey subdivisions of 30 or more homes, basically, in California, without a secondary access, to give them recommendations on how to improve their fire safety. What these regulations do is kind of set up sort of and that you have to repeat that survey every 5 years. So what these regulations do is kind of set up the guidance for how to complete that survey. What qualifies a jurisdiction as, or what qualifies an area as a subdivision of 30 homes with secondary access, et cetera. How those can be identified, that the board's going to do this survey, that the board is going to keep a list of these jurisdictions. So what this does is set you, the board, and the fire marshal's office up so that when it comes time to go and survey these subdivisions, there's clear implementation guidance to whoever is going to be doing that. So that's just some context.
So this stuff is complex and has a lot of implications for many people in the state. But it's our job, and we're going to do it. We're just not ready yet. So with that, I will conclude and thank you for doing all this work, and also the planning team, and conclude the RPC report.
Great. That's going to be an interesting bit of work. So we have 3 items left on our agenda. We have only one of our advisory committees reporting, which would be the effectiveness monitoring, and Dr. Finley and our liaison and co-chair of that committee, Sorry, will be involved in that. We have a presentation from the California Public Utilities Commission representative and a public forum. It's 12:15. I think we should probably take a break here to give due consideration, because here's a possible action item with the E&C report. Let's break and let's try and reconvene by 1:10. And we'll start off with Dr. Henry's. Thank you.
Connor fix the clock.
Board's in recess. I'd like to call the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection back into order. We are at item 11 on our agenda for the advisory committees, and our only report is from the Effectiveness Monitoring Committee. And I believe this will be given mostly by Dr. Henley, but remember, Sorry, who's co-chair of TNC, may jump in at some point. Russ?
Thank you very much, Chairman Gillis. Good afternoon, board members. Russ Henley, California National Resources Agency, here with the Effectiveness Monitoring Committee report. And we have a couple of updates and some potential action items for you today. First, in terms of updates, the EMC met on October 26th in Ukiah. The main topics for the meeting were to review 7 initial project proposals, EMC monitoring proposals that we received as a part of our most recent request for proposal, and our work in finalizing the documents we brought forward to you for your consideration today, the strategic plan and the new annual report plan document. So, as I said, we reviewed 7 initial concept proposals. This is part of our what is now an annual cycle for project proposals. We had been doing 2 a year, but this was not working in terms of our timing of the process to ensure we could get through the budget year and have approved proposals selected and have the contracting done to get the money in place for that. So we're doing 1 cycle per year, and the details of that cycle are lined out in the document you'll have to look at today. And so we were reviewing the initial concept proposals we received in September. So there were 7 proposals, and we accepted 5 of them and asked the preparers, the principal investigators, to prepare full proposals. And there were 2 of the proposals we decided not to move forward with. So the 5 proposals we did accept were, just very briefly, there is one from the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement and the Pacific Southwest Research Station, taking a look at harvesting impacts on denning and rest sites for the Pacific Martin Sierra subspecies. A proposal from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to examine how fire and salvage harvesting under the forest practice rules, exemptions, and emergencies affect spotted owl site fidelity. A proposal from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and Collins Pine to look at the effectiveness of the meadow restoration special prescription under Forest Practice Rule Section 933.4E. Second proposal from Cal Poly and Cal Fire to look at the impacts of using mechanical harvesting equipment in watercourse and lake protection zones. And this would be done as part of a Latour demonstration state forest timber harvesting plan that includes a meadow restoration project. And the final project we approved was a collaborative project from Oregon State University, Green Diamond Resources, and Cal Fire to look at the effectiveness of the forest practice rules at protecting riparian functions of Class 2 large streams with respect to canopy closure, stream water temperature, and primary productivity. Our primary concerns with the 2 proposals that we did not accept is that one was really addressing a more basic research question that really didn't have a direct enough tie for us to forest practice rule evaluation. And then secondly, the other proposal we feel just was not well enough conceived and designed in order to test forest practice rule effectiveness. So we've got some sharp people on our committee. They're bringing their science minds to work, and they're saying this doesn't make the cut. So we've had some really good discussions on that. Any questions on those before we go on to the action items?
Just pick off your last comment. Do you still have 2 slots you're trying to fill?
For academic?
For academic?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it's been tough.
The only other thing is that the ones that we did forward are the ones that we asked for a full project proposal. What's the date that you used?
It's in early December.
Because they were the short proposal, the first one, and then we sent back a request for them with some comments.
Yeah, some of them we had a few questions or clarifications we asked them to address in their full proposal. Some of them we thought, go ahead and give us the full presentation. And we don't, our full project proposal is not a huge demanding piece. It's fairly simple and straightforward. We've tried to keep this easy, but still robust enough so that we can really judge the quality of the projects appropriately. So we also have before you as potential action items 2 documents related to our planning processes. And
We typically have been bringing you the strategic plan every year with some typically minor updates for your review and approval. And we typically try to complete this process by the end of the calendar year so we can have the finalized documents in place by January 1st. So we took a little harder look at the strategic plan this year, perhaps than we have in the past, in part because feedback we've gotten from some board members about the length of the full strategic plan document, and it's pretty substantive in terms of addressing issues and process and the things that we feel are important to be evaluated. So in our meetings, we decided that we think having that kind of document is still really important for our program, but it really is not something that needs to be updated annually. Perhaps every 3 years would probably be a reasonable update cycle for that, unless something significant came along, then we could do that. And well, in addition to that, then, we decided to provide you and the public with a much shorter document we're calling a annual report and work plan. Basically, what have we accomplished in the past years? What are we going to be doing going forward over the next year? Provide summaries of the projects we've supported, updates on the results that are coming in from projects we've supported that are moving along in the process. So that's one of the 2 documents that we have before you. The strategic plan document itself is a little bit shorter. We did a little bit of reorganization to make it flow better. There are some areas where we cut out a little bit of detail because it was excessively detailed, more than we thought needed to be. That might require more frequent updates because of that level of detail. And we also moved some of the information to our ENC website. So a shorter document, and then the website will have the most recent information since we are looking to go to this 3-year renewal cycle. So I think we've got 2 good documents now. The annual work plan, very short, very accessible for the public to grasp what's going on, and then the more substantive strategic plan, we read that every 3 years. So, Chair Kusari, would you like to add anything? You did a lot of the work on some of the reorganization and the strategic plan. Anything you would like to add?
No, I would just say that I think this makes it easier to do the yearly board report because everything you'll need for that is in the shorter documents. And also thanks to Connor and Brandy for all the editorial work that they did on getting these 2 documents together. That's all I have.
Okay. And there was one point I did want to highlight that we sort of indicated as a board decision point in the annual report and work plan, and that's regarding our decision-making process for funding projects. And we've talked about this with you a couple of times in the past, and we just wanted to reiterate to make sure you understand this part of the process, and that's sort of who makes the final funding decision of the allocation of our funds on research projects every year. And so when we first got funded, we brought this to you, and the board decided to delegate that to board staff to make that decision based on the recommendations of the ENC regarding that funding. And the board staff have followed those recommendations very closely to date, we could say. But that was just an area of process some people sometimes had questions about or weren't quite clear on that. So just wanted to bring that to you very explicitly today. So A, to make sure you understood it, and B, if you wanted to reconsider that and perhaps take that responsibility on yourself. That's just there for your consideration.
I would say I read that part carefully. Thank you for calling out the decision point. The splitting of the document, I really like. I think it's much more usable this way, and I like the annual report being manageable and concentrated on what happened. On the decision point, I think actually what you've got is something which is very close to the experience most researchers have going to an agency. And so I think actually it's closer to best practice. So if you think about it, you're on an NSF panel, you're reviewing proposals. The panel makes a recommendation, but they don't actually make the final funding decision. That would actually be the program officer and the staff of the National Science Foundation. So in a way, by having the ENC members vote on proposals for funding or partial funding or not appropriate at this time, and passing that to the staff for administration mirrors your experience elsewhere, and I think actually might make the situation both for the reviewers and the people being reviewed more parallel to their lives as researchers elsewhere. Put it in a socially acceptable context. So I'm very much in favor of the way you've resolved this. I think it's really the appropriate way to state it. No problem. Especially as maybe one of the few people that might actually at some point have been an applicant to something like this, I think I'd be very comfortable sitting on the other side as a researcher seeing this, and I think, from the chairman of the board standpoint, looking at the way you make decisions like this, where you entrust the actual execution to someone else. Good resolution.
Both documents are here for your consideration for action today. If you're ready to take action today, that's great. If you'd like to have more time to look at them and come back and take action next month, that would certainly be timely for our process. So we'll leave that in your hands.
So we have no one asking to comment on this item online. Before we just go to some board discussion, is there any request for agency comment on the reports as they've been distributed? Or any public comment from members here?
I'd just like to make one quick comment. I do appreciate the committee integrating the comments of the board, and I think what we've come up with here is an excellent resolution, and just appreciate you considering those comments, so thank you.
Thank you.
So, board members, let's take it to board discussion at this point. I think the real question here that I'm looking for some guidance on is whether you feel you had enough time to review these documents that are comfortable with the contents, or whether you feel it would be more advantageous to wait. We can wait until the next month if you would like more time to review the documents.
Is our action going to be approval of the document, or what action do we take?
I'll turn to the executive officer, but it's a report to us. I think it would be accepting the report.
It's a board standing committee or advisory committee, so you'd be approving the strategic plan
Right.
and approving the annual work plan.
Yeah. So in accepting it, it is an approval
They
action.
do report to this board.
Yeah. Other questions or comments?
It's a question. No, I think this is looks really good. The question is, when a project is granted funds, have any of them had issues with pulling off the project with the allotted funds, or asked for additional augmentations or anything like that? I was just curious.
We have not had that happen. This is our third cycle of review and project funding, and that has not been an issue so far, and projects are started getting reports back on their progress, so far, so good.
Good to know. Okay.
Yeah, the other kind of question that was implicit in there was how often we want this group reporting back to us. In a sense, it's a standing kind of advisory group. We can do that on whatever interval we feel is appropriate. My guess is more than quarterly would be overkill given the cycle of funding and the cycle on which results come out from studies. And it might even be like 3 times a year, but we can time that to reportable action.
Yeah, and we're basically here every month. Either Member Pasari or myself are here every month. So if there's something worth reporting, we'll certainly report on a monthly basis.
All right. I think this would be 2 separate actions if we proceed today.
You could treat these as 2 separate actions. If you feel comfortable with the documents before you, you can treat it as one action. reminding yourselves that the strategic plan was approved today, although it's dynamic in nature, probably will not be, unless there's a problem foreseen in the next year or so, probably won't be revised again for a couple of years. The annual work plan, annual report and work plan will be brought to you each and every year. So I don't really know if that affects the way that you look at it in terms of motions, but you could approve the strategic plan separately from the annual report and work plan if you wanted to, or you could treat them as
So I guess I'm going to turn to you for some guidance here. If you feel I'm not hearing any requests, and so I'm trying to flush them out as to whether people want to wait a month, but I'm not hearing or seeing evidence that the board is not impressed with both the decision to split the strategic plan and with the key decision element embodied in the annual report, which is the part on the allocation being delegated to the board staff.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of work on it. I think there's still a few little editorial things that a few formatting things that need to be taken a look at. I don't know, Brandy, whether you were able to fix that. The table of contents looks like it worked this time. Yeah, so
the automatic feature.
It was one of those. It had a bunch of Stu Barber put a bunch of ghost-like commands in the table of contents that every time she would try to fix it, it would. Or maybe it was meant. It would flip out. Anyway, it would flip out and reformat itself. So I'm comfortable with it. I mean, it just depends on whether the board members think they would have time to really put a lot of time into it. I mean, we've had a lot of eyes on it, and it doesn't just include staff, and Russ has really gone over it, and so have the EMC members. So, it's not necessarily possible to be perfect, but I think it's in pretty good shape.
Looking over it last night, I was impressed. I'm not sure that a lot more editing will improve its impact.
Yeah, and we have a lot of other things to edit.
It would be ineffective use of it.
Yeah, I'm ready, but and I think Russ is comfortable with it too. But you have to speak for yourself.
Certainly ready. I would certainly not want to badger the board on this.
These late stage jokes are quiet. In case you didn't get that. That one was at me.
This is terrible.
So I would suggest we make a motion, and if board members want to opt out, there's no problem with saying no. So as the co-chair, I'll leave you.
Okay. Well, then I'll make a motion that can we approve them both? That we approve both the strategic plan and annual work plan for this year.
Second.
Okay, second by member Andre. Board discussion on the motion.
So nothing jumped out in here at me in reviewing it, but is there anything that either of you want to draw to our attention, anything significant, or looking we ought to give maybe a little more consideration, so we move it?
I think, nothing beyond what we've already pointed out. One area we did update in the strategic plan, there's sort of a statement of priorities from each of the agencies involved, and everybody went through and did some updates to those. I don't think there were any really big changes there, for example. So, I don't think there's any major departure from what we've seen in the strategic plan from previous years.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually laid out the process that we used. It wasn't there before, and I think that helps. That'll help people understand what we're doing.
I would just suggest that the two, in my mind anyways, two of the most important pieces of it are the themes that are outlined as themes that a project investigator PI would tie to as they're submitting projects. There was no new themes added this year. The themes are the same as they were last year and the year before, although there might have been one added 2 years ago. So the themes stay the same, they are unmodified. And then the process that Jared Gillis was discussing about project review ultimately and ultimately resulting in ranking and funding. Those are the pieces that are of most importance when I read it, when I look at it. Looking at it through the lens of somebody that may want to prepare with these. But again, it's a dynamic document. So if you're looking through the themes over the course of the next several months, and you, as a member of this board, determine that there should be a different theme, something added, then you would relay that to myself or to one of the co-chairs, bring that to the committee, and possibly result in a revision of the strategic plan, adding a new theme, or a revision to process, or something like that.
Any further discussion or comments?
So we are considering this a living document, and we're not stuck to annually dealing with it.
If we want to come right back to this next month, we could.
Well,
Yeah, in that sense, yeah, it's like any other document adopted like this by the board.
I thought you were able to run and put it well. Don't let it perfect. Hey.
Yes. Okay. Seeing no other requests for comment, let's call the question.
Janai?
Aye.
Delbar? Aye. Willis?
Aye.
Andre?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari? Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
Very good.
Thank you, and I also do want to express my appreciation to board staff for all of their comments.
All right, that brings us to item 13, under special board hearings and reports. We have a presentation from the Activities Commission and Justin Farrow.
Actually, the presenter,
Doesn't look like it.
the presenter should change the cocoa. He will introduce himself.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys for allowing us to present. My name is not Jocelyn Pereira, it's Coco Timosian. I'm a senior utilities engineer within the Safety and Enforcement Division of the California PUC. And quick administrative note, is someone controlling the...
It's right there. There's a, yeah, right there next to there's a, no, on the,
later. Okay. And so, without further ado, this agenda has been slightly updated, but I'll try to get into some background information regarding the PUC's vegetation management regulations, and I'll also provide you guys an overview of the regulatory structure regarding vegetation management at the PUC. I will provide you guys, to the best of my ability, the key takeaways from the vegetation management regulatory history as far as changes that have been adopted. And what's not on this agenda here, I gave a presentation several months ago to the Resource Protection Committee regarding the PUC fire safety rulemaking and fire threat mapping efforts. I've retained some of those slides in here towards the end of this presentation, just for context. I can breeze through it if necessary. So, without any other delay, I'm going to preface this part of my presentation by saying, be analogous to watching a movie where you're introduced to the various characters and their backgrounds, but you don't see how they interact until later on, so just bear with me. So, the PUC was originally created in 1911, or established in 1911 through constitutional amendment. In 1912, the Public Utilities Act was passed. Originally, in 1911, we were the Railroad Commission. And in 1912, the Public Utilities Act was passed, which expanded commission authority to natural gas, electric, telephone, and water utilities as well. Then, in 1946, the commission was later renamed the California PUC, which it remains today. In regards to the commission's vegetation management regulatory structure, the guiding document is General Order 95, which provides our rules for overhead electric line design, construction, and maintenance. And that is the rule book by which my division enforces regulations, among the several other GOs. But specific to vegetation management is Rule 35. Rule 35 provides specific requirements, general guidelines, and it also references Table 1 of GO 95, which actually provides the specific clearance requirements, and also references an appendix to the GO, which is Appendix E, and is provided as a set of guidelines to Rule 35. Table 1, like I said, provides the minimum requirements. Table E, Appendix E, mind you, they're guidelines and not requirements. So then,
the minimum clearance are guidelines, not requirements?
no, minimum clearance is provided in Table 1. Those are
Right, so
requirements.
Appendix E is the guideline.
Appendix E is a guideline, correct. So just a quick GO 95 history. GO 95 was adopted originally in 1922, was at that time called GO 64. It was later revised to reflect changes in modern construction and industry practice in 1928. And later in 1941, the Commission adopted GO 95, replacing GOs 64 and 64A. And the effective date of GO 95 was July 1st, 1942. So, with that in mind, I do want to provide a brief overview of work that the Commission has done in regards to wildfire safety. And the reason for that is it has a direct nexus to the vegetation management requirements. So in October 2017, or October 2007, you had the San Diego County and Malibu Canyon wildfires. In response to that, in November 2008, the Commission issued its fire safety rulemaking. And the initial focus of the rulemaking was had a distinct focus on Southern California. At that time, it was believed that there was a great variance in fire threat in Southern versus Northern California. Then in August of 2009, the Commission issued a decision adopting an interim fire threat map, or maps, mostly based on the CAL FIRE FRAP Fire Hazard Severity Zone map, and adopted regulations, all of which applied only in Southern California. And at that time, don't quote me on this, but I believe Southern California was defined as pretty much every county south, inclusive of Ventura and south. Later in May of 2015, the Commission closed that prior proceeding and retained the remaining scope of that proceeding in a new proceeding. And then in September 2015, while that proceeding was underway, the Butte fires occurred, and that really was an eye-opening event that broadened the focus of the rulemaking to beyond just issues in Southern California. Then in December 2017, the Commission issued a decision that adopted its current PUC fire threat map and the associated high fire threat district. And in January 2018, my division, SED, formally ratified those maps into GO 95. So, with that said, I'll get directly into an overview of the specific vegetation management regulations. GO 95, Rule 35, are what are enforceable vegetation management requirements. GO 95 references Table 1 and specific to cases 13 and 14 of Table 1. Case 13 are vegetation clearance requirements for all lines, and case 14 are vegetation clearance requirements for lines within the high fire threat district. Then Appendix E is also referenced in Rule 35. Appendix E, as I mentioned earlier, is a guideline for recommended time of trim clearances. And a couple of additional notes about GO 95. One important note is GO 95 clearances are all intended to apply radially. That's an important distinction. And another is that GO 95 is a set of minimum requirements. However, it does not consider any application of maximum clearance requirements whatsoever. So just a general structure. This follows along GO 95, Rule 35. Rule 35 is our requirements, referencing Table 1, and I'll I'll get into some examples of what Table 1 looks like in a second, but in essence, it's delineated into rows, which we call cases, and those cases are the rows describing the cases, and also columns that just identify the type of conductor in the Appendix E as well, as I mentioned in the guidelines. So here's a cutout of Table 1. This isn't all of it, but I included the relevant parts. As you can see, there's a case number 13 and 14. Case 13 is radial clearance of airline conductors from tree branches or foliage, and 14 is the same, but for the high fire threat district. And as you can see in the columns, it provides a series of wire classes according to voltage, which vary the clearance requirements. Also, one thing that's noticeable about Table 1 is there are about 3 or 4 pages of notes and exceptions that are included at the end of the table. I've tried to include a copy of the relevant notes to case 13 and 14 specific here, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then here are Appendix E guidelines to Rule 35. These are provided at the end of GO 95, and they're essentially recommendations of what the trimming should be done, or how much clearance should be taken at the time of trim in order to maintain the minimum clearance requirements in time between the inspection cycles. So I also went through and I wanted to provide you guys a quick comparison of GO 95 versus PRC 4293. One thing you'll notice off the bat is we don't like to be as straightforward as PRC. PRC has 3 voltage class delineations. GO 95, there are many more than that. In addition to that, the large differences being we have different clearance requirements in GO 95 for facilities in or not in the high fire threat district. So if you do a quick comparison, in essence, from my evaluation, the PRC requirements align pretty closely with GO 95 clearance requirements with respect to facilities in the high fire threat district. One thing of note, was brought to my attention earlier today, is I believe PRC requirements are applicable during fire season or enforceable during fire season, whereas GO 95 clearance requirements are year-round. So one thing I wanted to point your attention to was, as you notice, there are some discrepancies, for example, between let me go back a slide, the 22.5 to 300 kV class in the high fire threat district here indicates that the clearance requirement is 4 feet, whereas PRC 72 to 110 kV requires 6 feet, and above 110 kV is 10 feet. So with that in mind, I'll take you back to Table 1 and note FFF. And if you look, the section highlighted in red essentially aligns the clearance requirements in that voltage class with those requirements at 4293. Earlier today, this afternoon, I provided Matt with a series of packets. I apologize I didn't prepare enough for everyone. I didn't know how many people would be here, but I can provide them electronically. I have a change history going back to the adoption of these various rules and the various changes that they've gone through in accordance with commission process over the years. I have that available, but I'm going to try to go through some of the high-level overview and the substantive changes. If you guys care to delve into the specifics and minutiae of all the changes, that'll be available for you to do as well. So, going back in our timeline, GO 95 was adopted in 1942. Rule 35 is original to GO 95. It was in existence in 1942. However, in 1942, the text of GO 95 did not require any specific minimum clearance. All it mandated was that conductors could not have contact with foliage. Then in 1992, the first time Appendix E, page 2 was added. And page 2 was the reference is added to Rule 35. Then in 1996, and then shortly thereafter, a few months later, there were several changes made to Rule 35. One of which was substantive, was the addition of Case 13, Table 1, which provided minimum clearance requirements. Originally, in 1996, those clearance requirements were 6 inches. Several months later, there was a subsequent decision issued which increased those clearance requirements to 18 inches. Then fast forward, the next real substantive change in the vegetation management requirements came in 2009. In 2009, the Commission, as I mentioned earlier, adopted the interim fire threat maps. And adopting the interim fire threat maps, the Commission introduced Case 14 to Table 1, which required enhanced or more stringent clearance requirements in high fire threat areas at that time, which now we call high fire threat district. And once again, those clearances specific to Case 14 were only applicable in Southern California. Then in 2017 and into 18, the Commission issued a final decision in the fire safety rulemaking, which adopted the PUC fire threat map, put in place the PUC high fire threat district, revised Case 14 clearances from applying only in Southern California to applying statewide throughout the high fire threat district, and Appendix E clearance guidelines were also amended in the high fire threat district as well. So this is just a quick recap of the veg management requirements. Rule 35 governs veg management. Rule 35 has been in place since 1942 when GM 95 was adopted. Originally it was titled tree trimming. That title was changed to vegetation management in 2009. Originally it was also a no-touch rule, what we refer to. Clearances were added in 1996, then revised in 1997. 2009, high fire threat district, additional clearances were required. And in 2017, those clearance requirements were expanded beyond just Southern California to be applied statewide. So with that said, there's a clear nexus between the Commission's wildfire safety efforts and vegetation management requirements. And this just kind of provides a chronology of how those things went. And I won't delve into all the specifics, but it's just a summary of the various actions that the Commission has taken over the years. So with that concluded, I want to just give you guys a brief synopsis of our PUC fire safety rulemaking and our fire threat map and work that was done there. So the PUC first adopted interim maps. Those interim maps in 2009, those were the Cal Fire Threat Map, a modified threat map that was developed by San Diego Gas and Electric, and a REACTS map, which was developed for communication utilities. In 2015, the Commission initiated a successor rulemaking to the previous fire safety rulemaking to develop a single statewide map. And they also wanted to develop a high fire threat district to where all the regulations would apply. And that is what happened in December of 2017. And just for reference, the high fire threat district itself is composed of 2 separate maps. One is our PUC fire threat map, and the other is the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE joint map of tree mortality high hazard zones. So from the PUC fire threat map, we include tiers 2 and 3, and from the tree mortality map, we include tier 1 high hazard zones. However, as you'll see in this next slide, due to semantic confusion, we changed the reference to tier 1 high hazard zones in the high fire threat district. We call that zone 1. So as not to confuse the tier 1 as being lesser than the tier 2 or tier 3. And at the bottom there's a link. All of this information is provided, is publicly available, the maps. We have a GIS web viewer that you can toggle through and mess around with, and also all the raw data files as well. And here's just some images. This is the tree mortality map. The dark red there is the tier 1 high hazard zones. This next map is the PUC fire threat map. It's tiers 2 and 3 in orange and red respectively. Next is the high fire threat district map, which is a composite of those two maps. As you can see, it's probably a little difficult to make out the bluish areas that are zone 1, and that's because there's a great amount of overlap with tier 1 high hazard zones and tier 2 and tier 3 of the the PUC fire threat map. Just to give you guys an idea of size, the PUC fire threat map, tiers 2 and tier 3 cover approximately combined over 44% of the state's land area, which is a significant portion. And then more specifically, tying it back to our veg management discussion, the changes that were made to vegetation management requirements specific to the high fire threat district were changes to Rule 35, Case 14 that I mentioned that was expanded to be statewide and throughout the high fire threat district. The clearances in Appendix E, page 2 were changed, 6.5 feet to 12 feet, 10 feet to 20 feet, 20 feet to 30 feet. And one of the additional changes was to Electric Tariff Rule 11, which modified rules for discontinuance and restoration of service, with specific to customers' refusal of access to trim hazardous vegetation. So with that being said, this concludes what I have to say, but I wanted to offer up an opportunity for you guys to ask any questions or provide any comments. Thank you.
I have a couple questions, but board members, questions? Well, I'll just start. I was interested in the decision rule you used to move from the information in the mapping done by FRAP. So does your hazard assessment ever result in a reduced assignment relative to, the top assessment by FRAP? Or, so is it adding a decision rule to say, here are some areas because of the special threats caused by or to utility lines which say these areas are elevated, or are there some others which say, for our purposes, these areas aren't our concern? They may be a concern to someone else for some other reason. So how do I crosswalk mentally between these?
Sure. I would offer that I'm not a mapping expert, and actually the mapping portion of this rulemaking was led by Dave Sapsis of CAL FIRE, their FRAP team. So Dave would probably be the best person to answer this question, but I will attempt to. That was one of my big concerns, and Dave and I had dialogue over many years working on proceeding together, and my main concern today was I didn't want the perception that we shifted maps, and in shifting maps, we created a significant reduction in what was previously defined as a high fire threat area. And just to speak to that, so the previous regulations that reference the FRAP map were in reference to the extreme and very high tiers, which were, I believe, the top 2 tiers of that map. When we did a comparison, it actually might be, so if you look at the previous one, I think it's in there, we did a comparison of the land area covered by the PUC high fire threat district for tiers 2 and 3, and this isn't it, so I apologize, versus the FRAP. And the land area covered increased. However, there were slight changes to specific areas that may have been included as extreme or very high in FRAP that did not make tier 2 or tier 3.
Based on some kind of a proximity rule, or?
I don't want to speak to that because it's really out of the realm of my expertise. I would defer to Mr. Sapsis and his expertise. Also, I will reference on the website, the link that I had up on the previous slide, there are a series of reports and decisions that are linked on that page as well. One of the reports is the report that was issued by Dave Saps's team. We call that the IRT Independent Review Team. It consisted of Mr. Sapsis and a group of independent consultants. So it has the final assessment of how they applied their methodology in defining the tiers of the PUC firefighter method.
And in that document or any of the other documents we might find on the website, is there a distribution of ignition incidents or acreage lost which maps into the different voltage categories that you've got? In terms of, obviously some of those very small radio clearances are for distribution at a very low level in the transmission network. And so I was just kind of interested in both your rule setting for clearance systems, but your assessment of the maps. Did you actually break down kind of the threat or the loss history based on those distinctions in terms of how high up on the transmission network you're operating?
So there was some of that effort done, but not predicated on the distinctions that you laid out.
Mm-hmm.
So those voltage class distinctions are specific to clearance requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So table 1 provides clearance requirements of wires from objects and other structures. Table 2, which has a separate voltage class, don't ask me why, breakdown, is clearance requirements of wires from other wires. However, on that website that I referenced earlier, there's a set of links that provide access to the maps, one of which I'm actually pretty proud of that we worked with Dave and his group on, was we developed a GIS web viewer that launches in browser, and you can toggle on and off various layers. It auto-populates the high fire threat district, but there are a series of layers to California fire perimeters dating back to early 1900s. And you can toggle on decade by decade the various fire perimeters. And I have done that exercise. I actually was doing that earlier this morning. And the fire perimeters fall pretty well within the confines of the high fire threat district boundaries. So there was certainly some vetting and validation work that was done. And through the PUC and CAL FIRE MOU, we've been working on some interagency collaborations to further validate and vet that data and information.
Questions or comments from other board members? Member Janai.
With the ongoing growth of fire sizes in California, will your system be upgraded or reviewed on an annual or 5-year cycle for the changing vegetation types that are apt to be a result of these fires?
That's a great question. Currently, the update cycle for the map is, per commission decision, 10 years. However, one of the unique opportunities that was presented to us through the passage of SB 901 and the requirement for annual filing of mitigation plans and then the subsequent review of those plans is it really does provide us a feedback loop to engage in discussions and evaluations on how frequently that map needs to be updated. And one of that one of the mandates in 901 requires, as part of its mitigation plan, that the utility assess its service area to determine if any parts of its system require changing of tier classification, whether it's to increase or I think decrease. I'm not sure it says that specifically, so don't quote me on that. But there is an opportunity through the mitigation plans to evaluate pretty much on an annual basis the tier designations particular to utility service territory and whether or not they're sufficient.
Member Chase.
how do your clearance limits compare to those of other western states? And if they're more stringent, are you getting pushback from those utilities who operate in multiple states?
To my knowledge, the clearance requirements in the state of California specific to line clearance or vegetation are the most stringent in the country. I haven't seen any other clearances that mandate requirements more than what we do in California. With regards to pushback, my response to that would be anytime we look to make enhancements to regulatory requirements, we typically get resistance from regulated entities. And I'll leave it at
Member Wade. What relationship does the rule set that you just provided us have with the massive effort now going on right now with utility companies, PG&E in particular, out doing massive clearing work? What is this? Are they basing their work on this or something above and beyond?
I will speak to that generally. I am aware of PG&E's recent vegetation management program rollout. Quite frankly, I haven't had an opportunity yet. I actually have a meeting with PG&E staff later this month to really delve into the specifics and the logic and rationale behind the program. However, from my general understanding, what they do, what they're attempting to do, is if I can go back to Appendix E. So Appendix E was adopted, Case 13, Appendix E was adopted as a guideline to Rule 35. It actually very closely mimics PRC 4293. You can tell by the voltage class delineations that match pretty closely along with PRC. What was changed in December were the Case 14 clearance guidelines or suggestions. And to my understanding, what PG&E is doing is they have been applying the 12-foot clearance from Case 14, applicable to most distribution lines up to 72 kV. And what they're doing is they're applying that horizontally to create a 12-foot space along each side of the conductor. However, the variance from the Appendix E requirement, or the guideline, I should say, is Appendix E is applied radially. So you go out 12 feet and circle around the conductor. It's my understanding of PG&E's current program that they're putting no vertical cap on how far up they go. So they're clearing all overhang within that 12-foot corridor. So that's kind of the difference I see. I haven't really delved into many of the specifics, and I really don't know the rationale or justification beyond that from PG&E.
But your mapping effort here is largely back to provide sort of a decision rule for what radial clearance is going to apply. I'm just wondering if there are other purposes. You know, when we do designation for forestry purposes, it's explicitly timed back into some elements for public safety.
Right. So the map was created for scoping of fire safety regulations. The proceeding itself spanned nearly 10 years, starting in 2008, concluded earlier this year. And through that process, the assigned commissioner who was overseeing the proceeding changed several times. The ALJs overseeing the proceedings changed a couple of times. So the process itself meandered a bit. Ultimately, though, the requirements that were adopted specific to the map are inspection requirements, maintenance requirements. We have a rule, Rule 18, which mandates particular timeframes for correction of GM95 infractions, and in accordance with the priority rating system. And we updated all of the timeframes, the maximum allowed timeframes for corrective action in the high fire threat district. So that would be another example. We require more frequent inspections in the high fire threat district. So there's a number of rules specific to the map, not just the clearance requirements.
Yeah, no, I was just always interested as this was happening as to whether or not there was a potential for competing designations. It sounds like the audience for this designation and where it is applied is unique to the utilities you regulate and their activities, that there is not an additional kind of point where it goes into, say, local zoning decisions or necessarily the activities where an insurance industry might be considering things, that is limited to this purpose.
Absolutely, and I think that's an important distinction. The PUC fire threat map was developed and scoped particularly to utility fire threat, and the intended purpose was not for it to be used beyond PUC regulations.
Other questions or comments from the board members? Great. So we're going to have a few public comments. We have some people that can be online, some that may be in the audience, but we'll do these comments through the executive council.
So before I get to the public comments, I want to point out to the members of the board that myself, Mike Wilson, is in the audience here, and Coco also had spent some time putting together all the rules, regulations, statutes that, at least to date, that I've been able to identify that apply to this issue specifically, and that is embedded in your binder right now. And when Coco is referencing table 1 and the various cases associated with that table that apply to veg management and the reference rules that apply that are referenced in this table, those are highlighted. Because there's several cases in table 1 that don't apply specifically to veg management. So I would just suggest it's posted online, so everybody that's in this room as well on the webinar can download that. And I just want to point out that the text in that document that's highlighted applies to the point of discussion that we're talking about today. So with that said, we have 2 comments, both from Susan Robinson with Evans Passport Watch, and they're 2 separate comments, so we're going to take them one at a time. They're relatively short. The first is, was the project, in quotes, project CEQA decision by the CPUC just based on the regulations or also the guidelines? So it appears to me what she's asking is, did the guidelines in Appendix E, as well as the regulations adopted by the CPUC recently in 2017, go through a CEQA process separately, together, or at all?
So anytime that there's a rulemaking where rule changes are being proposed, typically the assigned administrative law judge and/or commissioner will set forth a series, pretty much a template or a series of questions that need to be answered, and the rationale and justification to support each proposal. One of the questions almost always is, does CEQA is CEQA review necessary? Without looking at the specific documents, I don't recall what the response to those questions were in the particular proposals. However, anyone interested in reviewing any of the changes can certainly reference the docket card or the fire safety proceeding, and the proceeding numbers in my presentation, and I can provide it if needed, which would contain all filings that came in on that docket, which would include a workshop report, which would have the individual proposals, and oftentimes there's competing proposals, so the justification and rationale for each, which would all include the response to the question of whether or not a CEQA review is necessary. I'm not comfortable answering that question specific to all the proposals that came in.
Understood. So Susan, if you're online, if you want that information, it sounds as though we can get you the information. So let me know if you want that. Secondly, the question is, when dead trees are removed from a community, will the hazard rating decrease? So I think what she's getting at is that I know that Susan lives in a community that has been afflicted by high rates of mortality due to drought. And it appears to me is what she is indicating is that that level of mortality may have been considered when the hazard ratings were identified. And once, I guess what she's asking is once those dead trees have been removed, do you believe or do you know that the hazard rating will be revised?
When we're talking about hazard rating, are we talking about the tier designation?
It's tough for me to tell because it just says hazard rating in here. So what hazard rating is she speaking to specifically?
So I think, to try to make the question concise, I think, given that the clearance requirements aren't changing, right? But you may have a change in the surrounding vegetation matrix because of activities through things like the Drought Mortality Task Force or other grants. Do those actions which would address mortality in the surrounding field matrix feed back in to in any way change what you've discussed with us today, which is your mapping exercise for the implementation of these clearing guidelines?
Okay, so as we discussed a little earlier, maybe I can get to it here. So there are two elements or two map sources that feed into the PUC high fire threat district. And the high fire threat district is where the regulations apply, or some subset of the high fire threat district. So in response to that, one of the elements that comprise the high fire threat district is tier 1 high hazard zones from the tree mortality map. So to the extent that those tier 1 high hazard zones are changed, then the high fire threat district would change to reflect that. But I don't believe until the next scheduled review cycle of the PUC fire threat map that those changes would have a direct influence on the tier 2 or tier 3 designations from the PUC fire threat map.
Any other?
No other comment.
Anyone else on that? So good question. Final word questions or comments? No? Thank you, and I look forward to looking over the pass out. But thanks for the website.
Absolutely, and if you guys have any further questions, feel free to route them to me through Matt. I'll glad to provide you any answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
So, that ends our special board hearings and reports and brings us to public forum. And I think you have some requests for comments from online.
I will address the online comments right now for public forum, and then if anybody in the room that has anything else, we can ask them to come to the okay. Number 1 is going to be an online comment submitted by Richard Giener with the question, looks like a whole new world with the Forest Management Task Force. Further complications for achieving true long-term forest stewardship standards. So that's from Mr. Giener. Secondly, we have an online comment submitted by Aga Takahashi, representing Rancho Mojito. The comment states, we submitted a written request for continuance on Rancho Mojito's petition for rulemaking to be concurrent with the CRM rulemaking or to be continued to early next year. We are not yet certain if we are even able to attend the December board meeting, and continuing the consideration of the petition slightly would be more productive for the reasons outlined in our letter. And I just stop here for one moment because Rancho Mojito did send a letter in. That letter was distributed to all members of the board last week, I believe. And that's the letter that he is referencing here. But since we are traveling from Southern California, we are requesting a continuance now so that we can try to plan our travel and arrange our schedules accordingly. And with that, I have no other online comments at this time.
And we'll take that under advisement. Anyone else in the room press for public comment? Hearing none, Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is adjourned.